The first thing I noticed wasn't the cold. It was how fresh snow makes the world look edited, smooth, bright, and too clean, until you spot the one detail that doesn't belong. A line of boot prints cut across my backyard in a perfectly straight path coming out of the tree line and leading right to my bedroom window. The prints stopped exactly beneath the sill. No scuffs, no turnaround, no trail going back, just a clean, deliberate arrival, and then nothing. Snow is supposed to be evidence. That morning, it felt like a trap. My brain kept trying to complete the picture. If the tracks lead to the window but none lead away, then where is the person on the roof? Hanging from the gutter, or already inside the house, watching me watch the snow. The night before had been a heavy storm, the kind that turns streetlights into halos, and makes every sound feel far away. I'd locked up without thinking too hard about it. Front, deadbolt chain, back slider, window latches, and went to bed early. When I woke up, the driveway was buried, and the road looked erased. At first, I felt that quiet relief you get when the weather gives you permission to stay home. Then I saw the prints, and felt my body switch into something older than logic. They weren't random. Whoever walked through my yard hadn't wandered. They had traveled deep tread, punching clean ovals into the white, like they knew exactly where they were going. I stayed inside and stared through a crack in the blinds, careful not to put my face to the glass. From the warm side of the window, the yard looked like a crime scene, with only one clue. The line began at the trees and ended at me. My first instinct was to tell myself a neighbor cut through. But neighbors don't stop at a bedroom window and vanish. I pulled on boots and stepped onto the back porch just long enough to confirm what my eyes refused to accept. The porch boards were wind-scoured, only a thin dusting trapped in the corners, which meant the texture of the ground changed right where the prints ended. I crouched at the last impression and saw a faint handprint pressed into the snow against my foundation. 5 smeared grooves, like someone had steadied themselves. The next move wouldn't have been away. The next move would have been up. I tilted my head back and looked at my window from the yard. The screen was still there. The glass looked intact, but along the lower frame where vinyl met sill, there was a narrow strip without frost, as if something warm had been held there. Then I looked higher toward the roofline. A ridge of snow sat on the gutter like frosting. Directly above my window, the ridge was broken into a shallow trough, too neat to be wind. I took a step back, and a sprinkle of snow drifted down onto my shoulders. The air was still. Snow doesn't fall off a roof in still air unless something disturbed it. I stared at the gutter until my eyes ached, and I saw it barely a tiny tremor like a body adjusting its weight. I went back inside, locked the door, and called 911 with my voice low, because the thought of someone above me hearing my words made my skin crawl. I told the dispatcher I'd found footprints leading to my bedroom window, and no footprints leaving. There was a careful pause then, she said. Stay inside. Do not go near the windows. Officers are on the way. Waiting felt like sitting under a ceiling that had suddenly become suspicious. I kept my phone in my hand and stayed in the center hallway away from exterior walls. I turned off lights without knowing why, as if darkness would make me harder to find. Outside, my backyard motion light clicked on, bleaching the snow in a harsh white beam. The prints looked darker under it, like bruises, and right at the end of the trail beneath my window I saw a new depression beside the last boot print. Shallow oval like a knee, like someone had been settling in to watch. I didn't want to look up again because looking up felt like admitting it was real, but I couldn't stop. Every few seconds, a tiny sprinkle of powder drifted from the roof edge, the kind of snow that should have stayed put. I kept telling myself it was settling, that roofs shed snow, that I was inventing patterns. Then I noticed the lower corner of my bedroom window, from the inside a faint smear on the outside glass, as if a palm or a cheek had rested there long enough to leave oil. I wiped the inside with my sleeve and the smear stayed. My stomach rolled. That meant it was on the other side inches from my face while I'd slept. 2 squad cars arrived, tires crunching through the plow ridge. I opened the door only when an officer was on my porch. He studied the tracks, then my window, then he looked up and his expression changed. His partner circled the house with a flashlight aimed at the eaves. The beam caught a vertical scrape along my downspout, where snow had been rubbed away in a straight line. Someone had climbed it. They positioned themselves in the yard and swept their lights across the roofline. At first, there was nothing, just white. Then the light found a rounded mound tucked into the trough above my bedroom. The mound moved. A head rose out of the snow, like it had been waiting for permission. A man in a dark beanie and jacket, dusted white, stared down at us, unblinking, almost calm, like my roof was a seat at a bus stop. For a split second, I understood the real horror. He hadn't arrived and disappeared. He had arrived and stayed. While I slept, he'd been right above me. The officers shouted commands. He tried to slide toward the far side of the roof, using the snow as cover, then stopped and slowly raised his hands. Another unit arrived with a ladder. When they pulled him down, his boots hit the ground and matched the tread in my yard perfectly. One officer asked why he was up there. The man smiled like he was sharing a private joke and said, "I just wanted to see you wake up." After they took him away, I stood in my bedroom and looked at the window from the inside. One of the officers came back a few minutes later, holding a small bundle he'd pulled from the drift where the man had been lying. It was a rolled-up foam camping mat and a silver emergency blanket, both damp from body heat. There was also a crushed energy drink can and a pair of cheap binoculars. He'd carved a shallow nest into the snow above my window, like it was a routine, like he'd done it before. The officer didn't say it out loud, but his eyes did. This wasn't a person who got lost. This was a person who chose your roof. The glass was ordinary. The curtains hung the way they always had, but the snow outside had already started filling in the prints, softening the edges, erasing the only proof that he'd been there. That's what I can't forget, how quickly winter covers things. How easy it is for the world to look clean while something is still on top of your house waiting for the lights to go out. Ever since, whenever it snows, I don't check the road first. I check the space beneath my windows, because I learned the worst sentence snow can write is the one that ends at you and never leaves. Months later, the case file called it trespassing and stalking words for something that felt like an invasion that hadn't finished yet. I replaced locks, installed cameras, and still couldn't sleep through a storm. Because snow doesn't just record footsteps. It teaches you where to search for absence and how terrifying it is when the absence points straight at your bed. I used to think snow made you safer. It slows people down. It leaves evidence. It turns the world into a blank page that shows every mark. That's why I didn't panic at first when I saw footprints in my backyard the morning after the storm. I assumed the snow had done its job and recorded someone passing through. Then I followed the trail and realized the snow hadn't recorded an intruder arriving. It had recorded an intruder leaving. The boot prints began at my back porch. Steps marched across the yard and disappeared into the trees. There were no prints coming from the street, none approaching my house, just a departure route, clean and confident as if someone had spent the night inside and decided to head out after the snow finished falling. I stared at the first print at the base of my steps, and the logic landed like a weight. If nobody walked up to my door through the snow, then whoever made those tracks had already been here before the snow started. The house was a small 2-story rental on the edge of town, backed up to woods that look friendly in summer and look like a mouth in winter. The landlord had installed a keypad deadbolt on the back door, one of those locks that clicks shut automatically when you close it. I liked that feature. That morning, I hated it, because it meant someone could leave and still make the door look perfect behind them. I checked the handle. Locked. I checked the chain. Fastened. I checked every window latch I could reach. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, which meant either the footprints were impossible or the person who left my yard had known how to lock up after themselves. I opened the keypad app that logs entries expecting to see only my code from the night before. Instead, there was a second entry at 217A. A guest code I didn't recognize. My hands went cold in a way the heater couldn't fix. I hadn't given anyone a guest code. I hadn't even had guests. I called my landlord, convinced there had to be an innocent explanation, a maintenance visit, a mistake. He answered half asleep and swore nobody had been out there. Not in a storm like that. I could hear the honesty in his confusion, and it didn't comfort me. Because if it wasn't him, then someone else had that code. Someone else could open my door, close it, and let the lock click shut like nothing happened. I walked my house slowly, trying to think like a detective instead of a victim looking for anything out of place. At first, everything looked normal, and that was almost worse. Normal meant hidden. Then I saw my scarf on the floor under the entry bench, half kicked into the corner. I told myself I'd dropped it, but when I picked it up, it smelled faintly like cigarette smoke. I don't smoke. In the living room, one blind slat was bent just enough to make a viewing gap, like someone had pressed their finger there to peek outside. Upstairs, my closet door was cracked open an inch. Not enough to be a mistake. Enough to feel like a decision. The house stayed quiet, but quiet isn't the same as empty. I kept coming back to the footprints, the clean line beginning at my door and walking away into the woods. Leaving was an act of confidence. Leaving meant they believed I wouldn't catch them. I stood beneath the attic hatch in the hallway and looked up. I'd never opened it. I didn't even own a ladder tall enough. Yet along the wall below the panel there was a crescent scuff mark, like something heavy had leaned there. On the floor against the baseboard, a sprinkle of pink insulation dust glittered in the morning light. My mouth went dry. If someone had been in my attic during the storm, they could have listened to me sleep the way you listen to a house settle. I called 911. I told the dispatcher I had footprints in fresh snow that started at my back steps and went into the woods, and my lock log showed an unknown code used at 217A. She didn't treat it like a prank. She told me to stay in one room with a lock and wait for officers. I chose my bathroom and sat on the tub, with my phone in my hand, staring at the crack under the door like it might decide to change shape. The officers arrived fast, but my mind filled the waiting with 100 versions of someone moving upstairs. They walked the property first. One officer came back and told me there were no other tracks. Not from the road, not from the neighbor's yard, just the set that started at my porch and vanished into the trees. Then they cleared the downstairs, then the upstairs, and finally they asked about the attic. The older officer's eyes narrowed when he saw the insulation dust. He pulled a ladder from his truck and opened the hatch. A spill of stale air dropped into my hallway, smelling like damp wood and something human. He aimed his flashlight up and went still. He didn't climb all the way in at first. He just watched the beam move across rafters, across cobwebs, across disturbed insulation. Then he climbed slow and careful. I heard a quick shuffle above me, like someone trying to stay quiet and failing. And then the officer backed down fast and told his partner to cover the opening. A second later, a man dropped from the attic hatch, landing hard on the carpet and trying to bolt for the stairs. The officers tackled him before he made it 3 steps. Up close, he looked younger than I expected. Face raw from cold hoodie, dusted with insulation like he'd been living in it. While they cuffed him, he stared past them at me with a look that felt wrong too familiar, like he recognized me from a distance. One officer asked how long he'd been inside. The man swallowed and said, "I didn't take anything. I just needed somewhere warm." The officer asked how he got the door code. The man shrugged and said, "You typed it." I watched. That sentence hit me harder than the footprints. I pictured myself coming home in daylight, punching my code into the keypad without thinking, my back turned to the woods. I pictured someone close enough to see my fingers, close enough to memorize my life from the edge of my property. The officers searched the attic and brought down what they found. A flattened nest in the insulation, an old blanket, empty snack wrappers, and a small notepad with my weekly routine written in block letters, work hours, grocery day, when my lights go out. Things I hadn't realized were predictable until someone wrote them down. Before they took him away, an officer walked me outside to show me one more detail. Near the tree line, right before the tracks disappeared, there was a shallow depression where the man had paused and turned. From that spot, you could see my bedroom window perfectly. The officer said, "He probably wanted to make sure you were still asleep." Then he added quieter, "Or he wanted you to find this." After they left, the snow started again, soft and patient, filling in the boot prints outside and erasing the clean proof of what had happened. And that's the part I can't shake. The storm I thought would protect me had covered his approach, hidden his time inside, and only revealed him when he chose to leave. Now, whenever it snows, I don't feel cozy. I feel audited, I look at the blank page outside my door and wonder what it isn't showing me yet. I changed the code that day, then changed it again, because I couldn't stop imagining eyes on my hands. The landlord called it a freak incident. To me, it became a rule in winter look for footprints that start at your doorway every time. The prints weren't boots this time. They were toes, 5 dents, and a heel pressed into fresh snow in a clean line that ran from the street to my backyard like a sentence aimed at my house. It was 12 below, the kind of cold that makes metal burn and breath crackle, and yet someone had crossed my yard barefoot. No socks, no shoes, no frantic hopping. Long, confident strides each step, leaving a faint, glossy rim where warmth had melted the snow and refrozen. My brain tried to argue with my eyes, but the snow didn't allow ambiguity. A human foot had been here recently, and it had walked like it wasn't cold. I took photos from the window first, zooming in until the screen filled with toe dents. Each print showed a slight outward angle, like the walker's joints didn't line up the way mine did, or like they were mimicking a human gait from memory. I tried to imagine a reason. Sleepwalking Adair drugs, but the cold erased all of them. At that temperature, bare skin is a timer. Minutes, not miles. And the trail wasn't a wobble. It was a route. I stood at my kitchen window, careful not to press my face to the glass, and followed the trail with my gaze. The prints cut past the fence gate, still latched from the inside, then angled straight to the corner of my garage. And that's where they stopped. Not in a messy scuff, not with a turnaround, not even with a stumble. They just ended at the wall, as if the person had stepped into the air and vanished. I put on boots and went out just far enough to see the details I didn't want. On the vinyl siding at the garage corner, about shoulder height, there were 4 faint vertical smears, like finger trails. The snow beneath them was disturbed in a shallow divot, the exact shape of someone planting their feet and reaching up. My eyes climbed the wall to the roof overhang, and I noticed a thin channel carved through the snow cap, too straight to be wind, too deliberate to be an animal. Something had pulled itself up. The bare footprints didn't vanish. They went above me. I went back inside and locked the door twice, as if repetition could make a deadbolt smarter. I called 911 and said I had barefoot tracks in my snow that ended at my garage and seemed to go up onto my roof. The dispatcher told me to stay inside. While I waited, I checked my exterior camera feed. The rear camera that should have shown the yard was pointed at the sky. Not broken, tilted upward gently like someone had adjusted it with care. The last normal frame was just after 1 in the morning. After that, only falling snow and darkness. That detail did something worse than scare me. It told me this wasn't impulse. Someone had time. Someone had attention. I walked the inside of the house, checking locks, then checked again, then stood still to listen. That's when I realized how loud a quiet neighborhood becomes in winter. No traffic, no birds, just my furnace and the faintest creak of wood under a roof heavy with snow. Every time the house made a normal sound, my body translated it into footsteps. I kept thinking about the gate latch. If the prints passed through my fenced yard, but the gate was still latched from the inside, then either someone had climbed the fence barefoot, or someone had been inside the fence before the storm and waited for the snow to fall. Both options were equally bad. Before the officers arrived, I made the mistake of looking up at the garage roof from my upstairs window. The snow cap should have been smooth. Instead, there was a shallow trough near the eave, as if someone had laid down and shifted their weight, compressing the snow into a flattened bed. Beside it, a small dark spot punctured the white, like a melted circle where breath had warmed the surface over and over. Something about that detail felt domestic, like the roof had been used as a room. Then very softly, my garage motion light clicked on. It stayed on for 3 seconds. Then it clicked off. Nobody was in the beam. Nothing moved in the yard. It felt like someone had tested it. When the first 2 officers arrived, they walked the perimeter and found the trail. One of them looked down at the toe marks and said flatly, "Those are human." They followed the prints to the garage corner and looked up. One pulled a ladder from the cruiser. I watched from inside as he climbed and swept his flashlight across the roofline. His beam caught a second trail, smaller, bare impressions pressed into the roof, snow leading toward the attic vent. Near the vent sat a single grey sock, stiff with frost, placed neatly as if it belonged there. The officer held it up, then looked at my house with a kind of professional disgust, like he'd just realized the building had been used. They searched the roofline and found a thin smear of skin on the downspout, like a hand had slid along it for grip, and a faint crescent of frost missing from my window frame, where something warm had leaned close. When the officer asked if I'd heard anyone on the roof, I lied and said no, because admitting I'd heard the creaks felt like admitting I'd been listened to first. After they took the person away, I found attic insulation on the top shelf of my closet, and an outline of a foot on the rung of my step stool, as if they'd practiced the climb in the dark above me too. Inside, they asked about attic access. I told them there was a hatch in my bedroom closet. I followed at a distance while they opened it. There were fresh smudges on the panel edge, dirty, wet fingerprints where snowmelt had mixed with dust. When the officer pulled the hatch down, a breath of cold air spilled out, carrying a smell like damp wool and pennies. He aimed his flashlight into the crawlspace. For a moment, it was only insulation and beams. Then, just beyond the beams, something pale shifted back, slow and controlled, like it had been trying not to move until it knew it had been noticed. The officer froze, backed down one rung, and told his partner to call for backup. He didn't have to explain. His voice had changed. More units arrived. They flooded the crawl space with light and found a person wedged between rafters, body curled into a narrow pocket, behind insulation like it was a nest. Their feet were bare soles, pink and raw, but there was no blood, no frantic trembling, only wide eyes that tracked us the way you track a noise in the dark. As they pulled them down, the person didn't fight. They didn't cry. They stared at me as if we'd met before, and whispered, almost kindly, "It doesn't hurt when you stop being yours." Later, a paramedic said they should have been unconscious in that cold, but the snow outside had already answered the real question. They hadn't been dying out there. They'd been walking, watching, and climbing, using winter like camouflage. By afternoon, new flakes were drifting down, softening the toe marks in my yard, until they looked like nothing. That's what I can't forget, how quickly snow erases proof, and how a bare footprint can be the most personal threat you'll ever see, because it means someone chose to touch your home with their own skin, then went above your head to wait. After it was over, an officer told me the barefoot tracks were what he'd remember, because boots are a choice, but bare feet are contact. I bought more cameras, but the first time it snowed again, I didn't check the street. I checked the white space beneath my windows and my gutters, because winter doesn't just reveal visitors. It teaches them how to hide. I found the tracks at sunrise, and for a second I actually felt relieved, because at least they weren't headed for my bedroom window. They were headed for my chimney. A set of boot prints crossed the fresh snow from the sidewalk, cut through my side yard, and stopped at the brick stack that ran up the outside wall of my living room. No prints beyond it. No turnaround. Just a straight approach to a vertical surface, like the person had walked to the base of the chimney and then decided gravity was optional. Snow makes you think in diagrams. I stared at the last print and let the horrible math happen. If they didn't walk away, then they went up. If they went up, they reached my roof. If they reached my roof, they could reach any part of my house that wasn't meant for people. My fireplace hadn't been used in years. It was decorative, a brick mouth with a clean grate and a stack of fake birch logs I'd bought for the look. In winter, it was just another wall. That morning, it became a question. I walked the perimeter of the house in my boots, staying a foot away from the unknown prints, as if distance could protect evidence. The last impression sat inches from the brick toe, pointed directly at it. On the mortar line above it, there were faint dark smears, like a gloved hand had tested the surface for grip. The snow at the base was disturbed in a crescent, as if someone had braced then hoisted. I looked up the chimney and saw a thin ribbon where snow had been rubbed away along the bricks, a vertical path that shouldn't exist. At the roofline, the cap of snow on the gutter was broken into a shallow trough that ran toward the chimney stack. The trough ended at the chimney, like a signature. There were no prints leading away from it, just a smooth roof, fresh snow, and one disturbed channel that told me someone had been up there and hadn't needed to walk back. I went inside and tried to make myself treat this like a normal homeowner problem. Maybe a teenager. Maybe a prank. Maybe someone tried to climb and fell back into their own tracks. Then I walked into the living room and saw the fireplace. The damper handle, which is always stiff, was angled differently than I remembered. The chain for the flue, which usually hangs straight, was swaying slightly, like it had been touched recently. The air in the room smelled faintly metallic, like cold soot. I crouched and looked up into the dark throat of the chimney. A dusting of fine black ash clung to the brick, and right in the center was a clean oval where something had rubbed it away, smooth as skin. I backed up so fast, I banged my shoulder on the coffee table. I locked the front door, then realized how stupid that was if the threat was already above the ceiling. I locked it anyway. I called 911 and said I had footprints in the snow leading to my chimney and signs my fireplace flue had been opened. The dispatcher asked if I could leave the house. I looked at the chimney again and said no, because the idea of walking past that living room window felt like walking under a gun you couldn't see. She told me to wait in a room away from the fireplace until officers arrived. Waiting was worse than the discovery. Every sound became a message. The heater kicked on, and I heard it as footsteps. The house settled, and I heard it as someone shifting their weight inside the walls. Then from the living room I heard a faint, dry trickle like sand falling through fingers. A second later, a soft tap like something small had hit the metal grate. I stood frozen in the hallway, staring toward the living room doorway. Another trickle, another tap. Soot doesn't fall, in steady, measured intervals. Someone was moving. When the officers arrived, they came in with their hands near their holsters, but their eyes went to the fireplace immediately, like the same thought had already formed in their heads. One officer walked outside to follow the tracks. The other stayed with me and asked if I had a fireplace ladder, if I knew how to access the roof. I told him no, and hated how helpless my own answers sounded. The officer outside came back with snow on his shoulders and said he climbed it. They called the fire department, and within minutes, my quiet street filled with the low rumble of a truck and the flash of lights on snow. A firefighter in a helmet looked up the flue with a long inspection camera. The screen showed darkness, then a smear of movement, then something pale pressed close to the lens. For a split second, an eye wide and wet, and then the feed went black like the camera had been slapped. The firefighter swore under his breath and told everyone to step back from the hearth. They opened the clean-out panel at the base of the chimney outside. A puff of ash drifted out into the snow, and with it came a smell like sweat trapped in old brick. From inside the chimney there was a scrape, then a low exhale that sounded almost like laughter. The officers drew their weapons and yelled commands into the flue. Silence answered, then a slow, deliberate tapping from higher up, as if someone was communicating in code. They decided not to force it from below. Instead, the firefighters set a ladder to the roof. I watched from my front hall as two figures climbed into the snowfall and disappeared above the eaves. A minute later, I heard a thud from above the living room ceiling, then another, like boots, stomping on rafters. One officer told me to stay back. I didn't need the instruction. My body was already trying to become smaller. Then there was a shout from the roof and a muffled struggle that sounded wrong in a place that's supposed to hold only weather. A few seconds later, something dropped down the chimney with a heavy scraping slide, like a body surrendering to gravity. It hit the firebox with a dull impact that made my glass doors rattle. The officers rushed forward, yanked open the fireplace doors, and dragged a man out by his arms. He was covered in soot, face streaked black and gray eyes, bright with panic and something else. Something offended like we'd interrupted him. He coughed and spat ash onto my rug, then tried to speak around a grin. "You shouldn't waste warmth," he rasped. "All that heat, and you leave it empty." They cuffed him on my living room floor while ash continued to drift down from the flue like slow snow. Outside, the fresh tracks that had led to my chimney were already softening at the edges as the day warmed. If I hadn't seen them early, the story would have been gone by noon. After they took him away, a firefighter climbed onto my roof again and showed me what they'd found. The chimney cap had been loosened, screws turned out with a tool, then set back in place. Someone had made a door in plain sight. They also found a narrow trail pressed into the roof snow leading from the chimney toward my attic vent, then stopping clean like a pause, like a listening spot. That night, even with the flue sealed and the cap bolted, I kept staring at the fireplace like it could open its mouth again. Because what changed me wasn't that a man had been in my chimney. It was the logic that got him there. He used the snow to hide his approach, used the roof to avoid my locks, and used a part of my house I'd stopped thinking about. Snow is supposed to show you where someone walked. That morning, it showed me where someone lived inside the vertical space of my walls, close enough to let soot fall in steady taps, just to remind me he was there. The footprints didn't go to my door. They didn't go to my window. They went to my drainpipe, and they stopped, like whoever made them had simply stepped into the wall and disappeared. Fresh snow turns a yard into a blank page, and those tracks read like a deliberate sentence, sidewalk to lawn to the exact corner of my house, where the downspout ran from gutter to ground. No wandering, no hesitation, no second sat. Just one approach, and a clean stop. The moment I saw it, my brain did the math I didn't want. If nobody walked away, then whoever came to my downspout climbed it. If they climbed it, they reached my roof. If they reached my roof, they found a place to hide that my locks couldn't touch. I pulled on boots and stepped outside, only long enough to confirm what the snow was already accusing. At the base of the downspout, the snow was churned into a shallow crescent where someone had planted their feet and pushed upward. The pipe itself had a vertical smear where frost had been rubbed away and tiny flakes clung to the metal in a pattern that looked like finger drags. Halfway up, right where the pipe met the first-story gutter, there was a thin, dark line in the snow cap, like a glove had swept it clean. I backed into the house and locked the door so hard the latch clicked, like a warning. Then I opened my camera app, because if someone had used my roof, I wanted to know when. The backyard camera feed was there, but the angle was wrong. It showed more sky than yard, like someone had nudged it upward. I scrolled through last night's clips. The storm made everything grainy, streetlights turning flakes into static, but at 2:43 a.m., my motion light kicked on and a figure stepped into the edge of frame. A man in a dark hoodie moved straight to the downspout and didn't look around like he was lost. He placed both hands on the pipe, tested it, and then climbed with a steady rhythm, boots scraping lightly as he went. At the gutter line, he paused and looked toward my upstairs windows, as if checking which room was lit. Then he pulled himself up and vanished over the eave. The motion light stayed on for a few seconds after he disappeared, illuminating nothing but falling snow. I called 911, with my voice low because the idea of someone above me hearing my words made my skin crawl. I told the dispatcher there were footprints to my downspout, with none leaving, and I had video of someone climbing onto my roof during the snowstorm. She didn't laugh. She told me to stay inside, stay away from windows, and keep the doors locked until officers arrived. The problem with stay inside is that it assumes inside is the safe side of the line. That morning, my roof felt like a second floor of the world that didn't belong to me. Every creak of the house, settling under snow, made my shoulders tense. I kept imagining weight shifting over my bedroom. I kept imagining a face peering over the gutter, patient and cold. 2 officers arrived and walked the tracks without stepping on them like they already knew they were reading a story. They looked at the churned snow at the pipe base. Then both of them did the same thing at the same time they looked up. One officer exhaled through his nose and said flatly. He climbed. They called for another unit and a ladder. While they set it, I watched the last boot print at the downspout slowly soften at the edges as sunlight warmed it, like the proof was trying to disappear while we were still looking at it. The first officer climbed and swept his flashlight across the roof, even though it was daylight, because bright winter light doesn't reach into the shadow behind a chimney. His beam lingered and caught a strip of dark fabric lying flat against the snow. Then the fabric moved. It lifted like a flap, and a face appeared beneath it, framed by frost and soot-smudged cheeks. The man had been tucked behind my chimney, as if it were a wall using the snow mound as insulation. He stared at the officer with a blank calm that made my stomach drop, because calm meant he felt safe there. The officer shouted commands. The man obeyed, slowly raising both hands. His palms were dark, with grime. As he crawled out from under the tarp, the roof revealed the rest of his setup. The mound behind the chimney wasn't drifted snow. It was packed down into a shallow nest, lined with a silver emergency blanket that crinkled when it moved. There were crushed snack wrappers half buried in the snow and an empty water bottle tucked under the eave. A pair of cheap binoculars sat on the shingles aimed toward my window line like they belonged there. They got him down the ladder and cuffed him on my driveway. Up close, he smelled like damp wool and old smoke. One officer asked why he was on my roof. The man stared past them at my upstairs windows and said, almost conversationally, "It's warm up there. Heat rises." The officer asked how long he'd been there. The man shrugged the corner of his mouth, lifting into a smile that wasn't friendly. "Long enough," he said, "to know which light is yours." After they put him in the cruiser, an officer went back up to check my attic vents. He came down holding a cracked plastic vent cover that should have been clipped tight. The fasteners weren't broken by wind. They were snapped by fingers. Someone had been opening a listening hole above my ceiling, letting warm air pour out like payment. The officer told me they'd seen people use roofs during storms because nobody looks up and snow covers the approach, and the height makes them feel untouchable. He said some of them don't even plan to break in. They just want proximity. They want the view. They want to be close enough that your house stops being a place and becomes a routine. That evening, new flakes started falling soft and patient, filling in the footprints near my downspout until the yard looked untouched again. But my eyes kept returning to the gutter line like it was the edge of a stage. The roof was supposed to be background, the part of a house you never think about unless it leaks. Now it felt like the first place someone could live close to you without technically being inside. I installed brighter lights, stronger cameras, and still the next time it snowed I found myself standing in my kitchen, staring at the downspout before I checked the driveway, because I learned a terrible kind of horror, the kind that doesn't need to come through your door. It only needs to stay above you and watch you convince yourself you were alone. The first sign wasn't a footprint. It was a pair of handprints, perfectly placed high on the outside of my second-story bedroom window, as if someone had pressed their palms to the glass and leaned in to look. In the morning light, the prints were obvious. 2 wide smears in the frost, 5 finger streaks on each side, and a faint oval of breath fog just below them. I stood in my room, staring at the glass, trying to tell myself it was condensation, a weird weather pattern, anything that didn't involve a person. But the pattern was too human. The spacing was exactly shoulder width. The fingertips had dragged slightly, like whoever made them had adjusted their grip to get a better look. What made it worse was the height. This wasn't a ground floor window you could reach from the lawn. This was the second story. I went outside and craned my neck until my eyes watered. The handprints were real. You could see a faint smear beneath them where something had rested, like a cheek or the edge of a hood. Beneath the window, the snow in my yard was untouched. No ladder marks, no prints circling the wall, no scuffed-up landing spot. The yard looked pristine, like nobody had been close enough to touch my house at all. That clean snow forced the worst question. If nobody stood in the yard, then where did those hands come from? I walked the perimeter slowly, trying to find the missing step. Along the side of the house, halfway to the backyard, I noticed a thin, wet smear on the downspout, where snow had been rubbed away in a vertical strip. Above that, the snow cap on the first-story gutter was disturbed in a narrow channel, like something had slid over it. I followed the gutter line with my eyes, and saw the porch roof below my bedroom window. From the yard it looked smooth at first, then I spotted it, a shallow trough pressed into the porch roof, snow leading straight to the spot under my window. At the end of that trough, right at the roof edge, there were 2 hand-shaped divots in the snow where someone had braced themselves. The snow wasn't just recording a visit. It was diagramming the route. They hadn't been standing on my lawn. They'd been standing on my porch roof. They'd climbed up using the downspout like a ladder, crawled across the porch roof, and pressed their hands to my window to look inside. I went back inside and checked the latch, even though it was locked. I checked it twice. Then I pulled the blinds down until only a thin seam of daylight remained, because suddenly the window felt less like a boundary and more like a thin membrane someone could press against. I called 911 and told the dispatcher someone had climbed onto my porch roof and left handprints on my second-story window. She asked if the person was still there. I said I didn't know, and I hated that answer. Officers arrived and took one look at the downspout smear and the trough on the porch roof. One of them looked up at my window and said quietly, "They were right here," in a tone that made her feel like a violation. They asked about cameras. I had a doorbell camera and a backyard camera. The doorbell footage showed nothing. The porch roof is out of its view. The backyard camera caught falling snow and a lot of darkness, but right around 1:12 a.m., there was a moment where the image stuttered. Then a hooded shape moved along the porch roof edge, low and careful. The figure didn't wave, didn't hesitate, didn't act like a kid on a dare. They moved like they'd done it before. Then they leaned into my window and held there still for long enough that it stopped looking like curiosity and started looking like ownership. The officers checked the porch roof and told me to avoid that room if I could. I didn't want to give up my bedroom, so I promised I'd be careful, and felt ridiculous saying it as if carefulness could outvote someone else's obsession. After they left, I couldn't stop thinking about the handprints on the glass. Not the threat of entry, but the intimacy of it. The fact that someone's warm skin had pressed to the cold surface inches from where I sleep. That night, I kept the lights off and sat on the floor beside my bed, back against the wall, eyes on the window like it might change shape. Snow began again around midnight, soft flakes that made the world look gentle, while my body stayed braced. Atunushais prezechal. The porch motion light clicked on and stayed on. For almost a full minute, nothing moved. Then a dark shape rose slowly from below the window line, as if it had been waiting right under the sill. Two hands appeared first, and then a head. The person pulled themselves up onto the porch roof in total silence and crawled forward on their elbows, keeping low like they didn't want the roofline to silhouette them. They stopped directly under my window and lifted their palms to the glass. The window fogged under their hands like it remembered them. I didn't scream. I didn't even breathe. I watched the pale suggestion of a face hover near the seam between blind slats, and I realized the person wasn't just looking for movement. They were looking for proof I was in there. They wanted the moment where my eyes met theirs, through the glass. I forced myself to stay still and dial 911 without lifting my phone into the light. I whispered to the dispatcher that the person was on my porch roof right now, hands on my window. As if they heard my voice through the glass, the figure froze. Their palms stayed pressed for a beat, leaving heat marks in the frost. Then they lowered themselves silently, hands sliding out of view, and the motion light clicked off like someone had flipped a switch. Sirens arrived fast, but not fast enough. Officers swept the porch roof and found fresh disturbance in the new snow, a kneeling print near the edge, 2 hand divots at the gutter, and a shallow drag line leading away from my window toward the side overhang. The ground below was still clean, no landing marks, no footprints leading away. It was the same impossible logic as the first time, except now it had happened while I watched. One officer shined his flashlight into the side yard and paused on a bare tree whose branches reached close to the roofline. He pointed at a branch where snow had been shaken loose, leaving a dark, wet stripe. Then he looked back at my window and said, "They didn't go down. They went across." When the officers left, I cleaned the inside of the glass until it squeaked, and it still felt dirty. For weeks after, whenever the temperature dropped and frost formed, I'd catch myself staring at the window waiting for the ghost image of those palms to reappear. The worst part isn't that someone can reach a second-story window. It's realizing how many roots exist above the level where you think to look, and how snow can make a house feel safe while it quietly teaches someone where your blind spots are. I didn't find footprints leading to my door. I found footprints that had been circling my house again and again, like someone was tracing the outline of my life in the snow. There were 3 distinct loops, 3 full laps around my home, each one laid on top of the last, with just enough variation to prove it wasn't an animal pacing. The tracks were human boot prints, deep tread, consistent stride, and they followed the tightest possible path along my foundation, close enough that whoever made them could have reached out and touched my siding as they walked. On the first loop, the prints came up, the driveway turned the corner, and hugged the wall all the way around until they met their own beginning. On the second loop, the same boots did it again, but slowed at every window, 2 or 3 extra impressions at each one, like the person paused there to listen, to look, to test what could be seen from inside. On the third loop, the pauses were longer. Under my bedroom window, there were 4 deep prints in a rectangle perfectly spaced, as if someone stood still for a full minute, facing the glass. The snow was fresh enough that the edges of each impression were crisp. This hadn't happened days ago. This happened while I slept. I stood at my kitchen window and stared at the loops until my eyes started inventing motion where there was none. The yard looked like a diagram, drawn by someone patient. And that's what made it worse than a straight line of tracks. A straight line means an intruder is moving from A to B. Circles mean the intruder had time. Circles mean they weren't rushing. Circles mean they were studying. My first instinct was to find where the tracks started because my brain wanted the comfort of a logical origin. But the driveway was plowed late, leaving churned snow near the street that could have swallowed the first steps. All I could see clearly was the ritual-free laps tight to the walls with pauses at the places where people sleep. I put on boots and went outside only because I needed to know one detail that mattered more than anything did the tracks ever leave. I followed the third loop around the back, then the side, then the front again. Nowhere did the prints break away into the yard. Nowhere did they head back toward the street. They just kept circling until they overlapped into a dark ring of compressed snow like my house had been fenced in by footsteps. The only place where the pattern changed was at my back door. The prints clustered there in a messy fan towing in and out as if the person had tested the handle more than once. Then the prints returned to the foundation path and continued the loop. Whoever did this didn't come to break a window and run. They came to learn my house. They came to learn where I wouldn't see them. I went inside and checked every lock with shaking hands, then checked again, because the idea that someone had stood under my bedroom window while I slept made my own home feel like a stage I hadn't agreed to be on. When I called 911, I heard myself trying to sound reasonable because it's hard to explain terror that comes from geometry. I told the dispatcher there were fresh footprints circling my house 3 times with multiple stops at windows and a cluster at my back door. She asked if I saw anyone outside. I said no. She told me to stay inside and away from windows. That instruction felt almost pointless because the tracks proved the windows were exactly where the danger liked to be. While I waited for officers, I pulled up my doorbell camera footage. Snow had been falling lightly after midnight, and the infrared made the flakes look like a swarm. Around 2:06 a.m., the motion sensor triggered, and a hooded figure entered frame from the side, not from the street. That was the first time my stomach really dropped, because it meant they had approached from the blind spot behind my neighbor's hedges, where my camera wouldn't catch them until they were already close. The figure walked to my front window, leaned in slightly, then moved on. The camera caught them again and again as they completed each lap, reappearing at the same angles like a predator pacing a cage. On the third pass, they stopped, directly beneath the camera, tilted their head up, and stared into it. The hood hid most of their face, but I could see the pale oval of skin and the dark points where eyes were. They didn't wave. They didn't rush. They just looked as if they were measuring how much I could see. Then, with slow care, they reached up and touched the camera housing. The image jolted. The view angled a few degrees toward the gutter, just enough to make the lower half of my porch disappear from frame. Then they stepped out of view, and the camera didn't catch them again. The officers arrived and walked the loops. One of them knelt under my bedroom window and stared at the clustered prints. He didn't need to say it out loud, but he did anyway. He stood here. Another officer followed the track cluster at the back door and ran his glove along my handle. He held it up to show me a faint, dark smear, like oil, from skin through fabric. They asked if I had neighbors with cameras. My next-door neighbor came out and pulled up his footage. His camera caught the hooded figure entering my yard from the side alley, then beginning the first lap. But the most chilling part wasn't the walking. It was what the person did at the end of each loop. They stopped near the same patch of shadow at the side of my house and looked up at my roofline like they were checking something above me. Then they continued. The officer asked if I had an attic vent on that side. I did. He walked over, shined a flashlight up, and found a faint dusting of insulation on the snow directly beneath the vent like it had been disturbed. He told me to stay back while they checked the attic. In my hallway, under the attic hatch, the officer pointed to the same detail I'd never noticed before, a faint scuff on the wall where someone could brace a ladder and a sprinkle of pink insulation dust on the carpet. It wasn't much. It would have been nothing on any other day. But paired with circles in the snow, it felt like the answer to a question I didn't want. The officers opened the attic hatch and aimed their flashlight into the dark. Nothing moved. They climbed anyway, slow and controlled, and I stood below with my hands clenched so tight my nails hurt. A minute passed, then another. Then the officer came down and told me they didn't find anyone up there now, but they found signs of someone being there recently. A flattened pocket in the insulation near the vent, a crushed water bottle, and a small strip of duct tape stuck to a rafter, like a marker. It wasn't a full campsite. It was worse. It was a temporary lookout, a place someone used briefly to get close, then leave no obvious trace. The officer explained it in a way that felt clinical, like he was trying to keep me from panicking. Sometimes people case a house by walking it, listening for dogs, watching for lights, counting cameras, learning which windows are bedrooms, which door is used most. The 3 loops weren't random. They were a checklist. The first lap is to learn the layout. The second is to confirm what you think you know. The third is to decide if it's worth coming back. When the police left, the snow started falling again, soft enough that within an hour the crisp edges of the loops blurred into grey. The ring around my house began to disappear, and that was almost insulting, like winter itself was trying to hide what had happened. I spent that day installing brighter lights and repositioning cameras, but the real change was inside me. I stopped thinking of my home as a place with walls. I started thinking of it as a shape someone else could memorize. And that night, when I turned off my bedroom light, I didn't imagine darkness outside. I imagined someone replaying those 3 circles in their head, knowing exactly where to stand to watch me sleep and exactly how long they could linger in the snow without being seen. The snow angel was right beneath my daughter's window, perfectly formed arms stretched wide, legs cleanly, swept like someone had laid down in my yard and made a child shape on purpose. Except no child had been outside. No neighborhood kids had been in our yard, and the angel wasn't playful. It was too deep, too crisp, too deliberate, as if the person who made it had pressed themselves into the snow with their full weight and stayed there long enough for their body heat to seal the imprint into ice. The edges of the wings were sharp. The center was polished smooth, where a back had melted the snow into a thin, glossy crust. And there were no messy hand marks, no laughing footprints, no running trail. Just one set of boot prints leading from the tree line to the angel, and then nothing leading away. The tracks ended at the head of the angel, right where the neck would be, like the person had walked up to the spot, looked up at the second-story window, and then laid down beneath it. Snow is supposed to be proof, but that morning it felt like a message, left where we couldn't ignore it. My wife thought I was overreacting, until she saw the detail that made my stomach drop. The angel's arms weren't symmetrical. One wing reached higher toward the window, the sweep mark angled up as if the person had raised their arm to touch the siding, then laid it back down. It looked like a gesture, not a game. I didn't let my daughter go near the glass. I didn't even want her to see it. I ushered her into the kitchen and told her to stay away from windows, like it was normal winter advice, like the world outside was simply cold. Then I stood in the hallway and stared at the spot beneath her room, trying to understand what kind of person makes a snow angel under a child's window. The boot prints were adult-sized deep tread and spaced in a steady stride. Whoever did this didn't stumble. They didn't wander. They came straight in. The thing that made it feel unreal was the missing exit trail. If the snow angel was made after the storm ended, and it had to be because it sat clean on top of untouched snow, then those boots should have turned around and walked away. But the snow beyond the angel was smooth, pristine, no scuffs, No backtrack. No place where someone stepped off the path. It forced a thought I hated. Either the person climbed up from there, or they were still close enough to avoid stepping in open snow. I grabbed my phone and checked the porch camera footage. Around 3:1 a.m., the motion sensor triggered. The screen showed falling flakes, the porch light casting a weak cone. A hooded figure entered frame, from the side walking low, staying close to the bushes. They moved, like they knew our camera's angle. They stopped at the edge of the yard, just out of the porch light's reach, and looked up toward the second story. Then they stepped forward and disappeared from the camera's field, because the camera doesn't see the space directly beneath the upstairs windows. The feed stayed active for almost 2 minutes, capturing nothing but snowfall, until the figure reappeared briefly at the edge again, and then vanished for good. 2 minutes is a long time to be invisible in a small yard. 2 minutes is enough time to make an angel. It's enough time to press your body into the snow beneath a child's window and listen to the house breathe. I called 911 with my voice tight and low. I told the dispatcher someone had made a snow angel under my child's window and left one set of tracks leading to it with no tracks leaving, and our camera showed a hooded person lingering in our yard. Around 3 a.m. She didn't ask if it was a prank. She told me to keep everyone inside, keep away from windows, and wait for officers. While we waited, my wife and I checked every door and window. Everything was locked. That wasn't comforting. Locks only matter if the threat wants to come through the same places you do. The officers arrived and walked the yard carefully, kneeling at the angel like it was a body outline, because that's exactly what it resembled. One officer took a flashlight, even though it was daylight, and swept it across the snow surface. "See this sheen?" he asked, pointing to the center of the imprint. "He laid here long enough to melt it." He said it the way you'd say someone had been waiting. Another officer followed the boot prints to the tree line, and I watched him pause, then look up at our roof. A minute later, he called the others over. On the side of the house beneath the gutter, the downspout had a wet smear, where frost had been rubbed away in a vertical strip. Above that, the snow cap on the gutter was disturbed, a narrow channel carved through the white, leading toward the eave over my daughter's window. They didn't find footprints on the ground beyond the angel because the person hadn't left on the ground. They'd gone up. The officers asked if we had attic access near that side of the house. We did. They checked and found the attic hatch, dusted with fine insulation particles that hadn't been there before, as if someone had brushed against it. They climbed into the attic and came down a few minutes later, with their expressions changed. They didn't find a person, but they found signs of one. A compressed pocket in the insulation near the vent above my daughter's wall, a few crushed snack wrappers, and a single glove stiff with cold tucked into the corner like it had been, placed there on purpose. They also found a thin strip of fabric snagged on a nail, dark cloth dotted with little white flecks where it had rubbed against frozen wood. The officer didn't say the next part to scare us, but it did anyway. He's been up there. Maybe not tonight, but he's been up there. The angel in the yard stopped being a symbol and became a timestamp. The snow showed us the most recent visit. It couldn't tell us how many times he'd done it before the snow fell. That afternoon, after the police left, I tried to erase the angel. I shoved snow over it with a shovel until the shape disappeared because I couldn't stand the idea of that imprint remaining under my child's window like a trophy. But the more I covered it, the more it felt like I was burying something I shouldn't have had to bury. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time the house creaked, I pictured someone above the ceiling shifting their weight. I kept checking the camera feed even though I knew our blind spot was the exact place the angel had been. Around 2:58 a.m., the porch motion light clicked on. The camera showed nothing at first. Then, at the bottom edge of frame, a dark shape rose slowly into view, just the top of a hood, as if someone had been crouching below the porch line and stood up carefully. They didn't step into the light. They stayed at the boundary where the camera barely caught them. A hand lifted, and a single finger pointed upward toward the second story. Then the hand dropped. The figure backed away without turning, disappearing into darkness like it was rehearsed. In the morning, fresh snow had fallen, smoothing the yard into a clean sheet again. No angel, no tracks, no proof, only the knowledge that the first time we noticed it was because the person wanted to be noticed. That's what still makes my skin crawl. A snow angel is supposed to be innocence pressed into winter. Under my daughter's window, it became the outline of someone's patience, and the sick certainty that they were close enough to listen, close enough to climb, and close enough to leave a child's shape in the snow, as a reminder that they knew exactly where we slept. The tracks didn't lead to my door or my windows. They led under my house. A neat line of boot prints crossed the fresh snow from the side alley to the brick foundation, stopped at the crawlspace vent, and then vanished, as if the person had stepped straight into the darkness beneath my floor and never came back out. Snow is supposed to be proof, but that morning it felt like a countdown, because the logic was brutal and simple. If the tracks go in and there are no tracks coming out, then the person is still in there. I stood at the kitchen window and stared at the vent cover, a rectangle of rusted metal half buried near the base of the house, and tried to talk myself out of what I was seeing. Maybe the wind filled the exit prints. Maybe an animal made them. Maybe someone walked up and then doubled back in their own steps, so perfectly I couldn't tell. But the snow was pristine everywhere, else crisp enough to hold tread detail, and the pattern wasn't confused. Each boot print was distinct, evenly spaced, angled the same way, and they marched straight to the vent with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. I put on boots and stepped outside only because distance felt dangerous. The cold hit like a slap, and the silence of the neighborhood made my own breathing sound too loud. The tracks stopped at the vent, and right at the edge of the metal grate. The snow was disturbed, in a shallow crescent, as if someone had knelt there. The vent cover wasn't broken. It had been lifted, tilted, just enough to create a gap, then set back down at a slightly different angle. You could see where the snow crust along the edge had cracked. A thin smear of dirt streaked the metal, and a few crumbs of dried leaves sat on top like they'd been shaken from a sleeve. I crouched close and saw something that made my mouth go dry. A faint handprint on the snow pressed against the foundation, 5 shallow grooves where someone had braced themselves and slid forward. Beneath the vent, the snow inside the opening was darker and packed down, not fluffy like fresh fall, but compressed, like it had been breathed on, crawled through, lived in. The crawlspace itself is one of those things you forget exists until it becomes a story. A low, cramped void under the house, where pipes run and spiders own the corners. The kind of place you don't imagine a person choosing on purpose. But the tracks in my yard didn't look like desperation. They looked like routine. I backed away and checked the other side of the house. There were no exit prints anywhere, no circling path, no trail back to the alley, just a clean approach to the vent, and nothing after. I went inside and locked the doors, even though locks don't mean much when the fret is under your feet. I turned on every light in the house, then hated myself for it, because bright windows feel like invitations at night. It was still morning, pale winter sun, but fear doesn't care what time it is. I called 911 and said as calmly as I could that I found fresh footprints in the snow leading to my crawlspace vent, with no footprints leaving, and it looked like the vent had been moved. The dispatcher didn't sound surprised. She told me to stay inside, stay away from exterior walls if possible, and wait for officers. That advice is hard to follow when the exterior wall is also the floor, when your entire house feels like it's floating over the place the person chose to enter. While I waited, I tried to listen for anything under the floorboards. At first, there was only the furnace and the faint tick of the refrigerator. Then I heard a sound that didn't belong, a soft scrape, slow and dry, like something dragging across dirt. It came from below the living room, then paused, then came again closer, as if whatever was under there had heard me standing still, and was responding with its own kind of stillness. My skin went tight. I backed into the hallway and sat on the stairs because the stairs felt like the most solid part of the house, like a spine you can hold onto when the rest of the body feels compromised. The officers arrived and walked the tracks with the careful focus of people reading a message they've seen before. One of them knelt by the vent, lifted the edge with a gloved hand, and immediately stopped. He looked at his partner and said quietly, "It's warm." Warm air was pushing out from the gap, subtle but real the way a house exhales through a crack. Warmth under a crawlspace vent in the dead of winter means two things. Either there's a broken heat line, or someone has been down there breathing. They called for another unit and a K9. While we waited, the officer asked if I had pets. I said no. He nodded, as if that mattered more than he wanted to explain. The dog arrived a lean shepherd with alert eyes, and the handler guided it toward the vent. The dog sniffed once, and immediately stiffened ears, forward body tense. It didn't bark. It didn't whine. It just stared at the dark gap under my house like it was staring at a decision. The handler's voice went serious. "Someone's in there," he said, not as a guess, but as a report. They set up around the foundation and told me to stay inside with the front door locked. I stood behind the glass and watched them lift the vent cover fully. The opening was just large enough for a person to worm through if they didn't mind scraping their shoulders raw. The handler shined a flashlight inside, and the beam caught a tunnel of disturbed dirt, leading inward like a trail in miniature. Farther back, something reflective winked in the light. The officer called out firm, telling whoever was inside to come out now. Silence answered. Then, from under the house, a slow exhale drifted out, audible through the vent like a sigh. The officer called again, louder. Nothing. The dog growled low, a sound that made the hair on my arms rise because it sounded like it recognized the shape of a threat. Two officers suited up with knee pads and masks, and crawled in, one holding a flashlight, the other holding a baton in a grip that looked too casual for how hard his jaw was set. Watching someone crawl under your home is like watching them enter your own body. It feels invasive, intimate, wrong. The officers moved slowly, their shoulders disappearing into the darkness until only their boots were visible, then nothing at all. For a minute, there was only the sound of their movement scrapes and soft thuds muted by dirt. Then the radio crackled. "We've got a setup down here," one officer said, voice tight. "Looks like someone's been living." Another minute passed. Then contact. The word landed like a punch. I heard a sudden scuffle under the floorboards, a sharp thump like someone kicking a joist, and then the dog barked hard, one furious burst that echoed off the snow. The officers reversed quickly, backing out of the opening with urgency that made my stomach drop. The first officer emerged with his face smeared with dirt and his flashlight beam shaking. Behind him, a figure crawled forward into daylight, palms flat in the snow, moving with a strange calm as if the cold didn't register. It was a man-gaunt hoodie, dark, with damp hair flattened from low clearance. His eyes were wide, but not panicked. They were focused, fixed on the house like it was still his, even as officers shouted commands. He didn't bolt. He didn't fight. He just looked up at the windows and said in a voice that sounded hoarse from whispering in the dark, "I didn't want to wake you." That sentence made my throat close. Not because it was a threat, but because it was a confession of proximity. He had been under my floor while I watched TV, while I slept, while I walked barefoot across the living room thinking the worst thing under me was dust. The officers cuffed him on the snow and asked how long he'd been there. He shrugged slow. "Since the first storm," he said. "It's quieter when it's white." They pulled items out of the crawlspace that turned my fear into something heavier. A flattened sleeping bag, a candle stub, a stash of granola bars, and a small notebook wrapped in plastic. The officer flipped through it with his gloved hand, and his expression changed. He didn't show me the pages, but I saw enough. My address at the top, notes about when my lights go out, a crude sketch of my floor plan with little X marks under rooms, like someone mapping where to listen. They also found a vent cover screw set on the dirt like a keepsake, and a strip of duct tape stuck to a pipe with a date written on it, like he'd been marking time down there. As they led him away, he turned his head toward my living room window and smiled faintly, like a person leaving a place they intend to return to. After they left, I stood in my house and felt every step differently. The floorboards didn't feel like shelter. They felt like a lid. That night the temperature dropped and new snow started to fall, gentle and clean, erasing the boot prints in my yard until the world looked untouched again. But I didn't feel relieved. Because snow doesn't just show you where someone walked. It shows you where someone chose to hide. And once you've seen tracks that end under your house, you never stop hearing the quiet scrape of something moving beneath the place you thought was yours. The mark in the snow looked like something had been dragged across my yard in the middle of the night, and what terrified me was how clean it was. 2 parallel grooves pressed deep into fresh white, running from the tree line straight to my basement window, with almost no footprints around it, as if whatever moved didn't need legs. I stood at the top of the basement steps with my hand on the doorknob, staring through the glass at that long dark channel cut through the snow, and my mind kept refusing the obvious explanation, because the obvious explanation felt worse than a ghost. Drag marks mean weight. Drag marks mean effort. Drag marks mean something or someone was pulled over the ground instead of walking. In the pale morning light, the grooves were crisp edges, sharp enough to show the snow had been sliced and compressed, not drifted. The track started at the woods, where branches hung low and shadows stayed thick even after sunrise, and it ran straight as a ruler across my yard to the small basement window that sits just above ground level. Right beneath the window, the grooves ended in a churned patch, where snow had been kicked and scraped like the person doing the dragging had stopped to adjust their grip. That churned patch was the only place I could find real boot prints, 2 or 3 partial impressions at odd angles, not a normal walking path, more like someone bracing and sliding. Then the boot prints disappeared again. No trail back to the woods. No path to the street. Just the grooves, a brief struggle at my window, and then nothing. Snow is supposed to answer questions, but that morning it only asked them what was heavy enough to leave that mark, and why was it brought to my basement. I forced myself outside because fear makes you either freeze or audit, and I needed to know one detail more than any other. Did the grooves stop because the person stopped, or because whatever they were dragging went inside? The basement window was intact, but the snowpack beneath it looked different. Damp and compressed, as if warm air had been pouring out and melting the surface. The bottom edge of the window frame had a faint smear of mud, and the mesh well cover that usually sits snug was shifted a couple inches to the side. I crouched and saw a thin line in the snow, leading from the churned patch to the bulkhead doors on the side of the house, like a secondary drag lighter, as if something had been pulled the last few feet on a different angle. The bulkhead doors were closed. They always were. But the padlock looked slightly off, as if it had been clicked back into place in a hurry. I touched it with my glove, and felt moisture, a thin film of melted snow that hadn't refrozen yet. That meant it had been handled recently in the last hour or 2. My basement has always been my junk space. Old boxes, a workbench, holiday decorations. I don't go down there much in winter. That morning, the idea of opening the basement door felt like opening a mouth you don't control. I called 911 before I did anything else, and told the dispatcher I had fresh drag marks in the snow leading from the woods to my basement window and bulkhead doors, and the lock looked disturbed. She asked if I could leave the house. I looked at the grooves again and realized leaving would mean stepping right into the path, erasing evidence, and possibly stepping into whatever the grooves represented. I said I'd stay inside. She told me to lock myself in an upstairs room and wait. I tried. I really did. But waiting with drag marks outside your basement is like waiting with a ticking sound under the floor. Every second your brain invents the wait on the other end of the trail. I stood in my kitchen and listened. At first there was nothing but the heater and the soft tick of the clock. Then, faintly from below, I heard a sound that didn't belong, a slow scrape like plastic dragged over concrete. It lasted 2 seconds, stopped, then started again closer to the stairs. My stomach tightened so hard it felt like nausea. I backed away, phone in my hand, and forced myself not to look down the basement stairwell because looking down felt like consent. When the officers arrived, they walked the grooves with their flashlights, even though it was daytime, because daylight doesn't help when your fear is in the negative space. One officer traced the path from the woods, crouching to examine the snow compression. "Sled," he murmured, as if naming it would tame it. Then he paused at the churned patch near the window and frowned. "But where are the steps?" he asked. His partner followed the faint secondary drag to the bulkhead doors and checked the lock. He glanced at me and said, "Someone's been down there." They didn't ask me to open the door. They positioned themselves on either side, one officer with his weapon drawn, the other with a flashlight angled low, and they used a bolt cutter on the padlock. The metal snap sounded too loud in the winter quiet. When they lifted the bulkhead doors, a breath of air rose from the basement, like it had been waiting, cold, damp, and carrying a smell that made my throat close. Wet earth and something sweetly rotten, like old fruit, left too long. The flashlight beam slid down the concrete steps and caught the first thing that turned my fear into something sharper. A wet streak on the steps darker than meltwater. A long smear with little ridges like fabric had been dragged over it. "Stay back," the officer said, and his voice had the clipped tone of someone trying not to escalate his own imagination. They went down slowly. The basement light was off, so their flashlights became the only reality carving the space into pieces. Workbench, boxes, furnace, shadows. Then one beam caught something in the far corner that shouldn't have been there. A plastic tarp bundled tight with rope sitting on a cheap garden sled, the exact width of the grooves outside. The sled runners were wet with snowmelt. The tarp had dirt streaks on it. Whatever was inside made the tarp bulge in a way my brain refused to label. The officer held his flashlight steady and called out, commanding whoever was down there to show themselves. Silence answered thick and heavy. The dog they'd brought in for the check, because winter calls for caution, started whining at the top of the stairs, a high, anxious sound that made my skin prickle. The officer approached the sled without touching it, at first scanning the ceiling joists, scanning behind shelves, scanning the dark gap behind the water heater. Then he crouched and used the tip of his baton to lift a corner of the tarp. The plastic crackled. Underneath wasn't a body. It was worse in a different way, a pile of items that made the basement feel like a confession. My missing things. A box of mail I'd reported stolen a month ago. My neighbor's package, with his address still on the label. A stack of women's scarves, none of them mine. A child's mitten. A cheap, prepaid phone. And tucked beneath it all, a small notebook wrapped in a grocery bag to keep it dry. The officer flipped it open and his face changed the way people's faces change when they learn your fear has a name. He didn't show me the pages, but I saw the margins filled with dates and short lines of writing, the kind of writing that looks like lists. He asked me carefully if I'd noticed anyone around the neighborhood at night. I thought of the woods. I thought of how the grooves began under the trees, where you can stand in shadow and watch a lit house, like it's a TV. I told him I'd seen nothing. He nodded, and I realized that was the point. Whoever did this didn't want to be seen. They wanted to move weight through my yard without leaving the usual human story of footsteps. They used the sled because sled runners leave a simple mark that can be mistaken for something innocent, kids playing someone hauling firewood until you realize it ends at your basement. They used the storm because the wind and snowfall hide sound. They used my bulkhead because it's the entrance nobody thinks about, the door you don't decorate, the door you don't look at every day. The officers searched the basement and found the final detail that made the grooves outside feel like a threat. Directed at me personally, one of the basement windows had a clean oval wiped into the condensation like someone had been looking. Out, watching the yard, timing the neighborhood, waiting for the right hour to pull the sled back again. They didn't find the person in my basement. That part might have been relief if the snow outside hadn't already told me the truth. The grooves began at the woods and ended at my house, and the only clear boot prints were at the point where someone had struggled with the weight. That means the person had been close strong enough to pull a loaded sled through deep snow, careful enough to erase their own steps by walking in the grooves, and smart enough to lock the door behind them. After the police left, snow started falling again, patient flakes that softened the grooves until they looked like a faint shadow, easy to dismiss as nothing. But I couldn't dismiss it because I learned something, that winter morning footprints are scary because they prove someone came. Drag marks are scarier because they prove someone brought something, and sometimes the thing they bring is evidence of all the other places they've already been hidden in the quietest room under your feet. It was still snowing when I noticed the first new print. And at first I didn't understand why my stomach dropped, because footprints in falling snow should be the least surprising thing in the world. But this wasn't a normal set of tracks you discover after the fact. This was a footprint that appeared while I was looking right at the spot, where it formed like the snow itself blinked and forgot what was there a second earlier. I was standing in my kitchen, with a mug gone cold in my hands, watching the yard through the glass, the way you watch a screensaver. Hypnotic, harmless flakes, drifting down in soft diagonals. The storm had been light all morning, just enough to keep the world quiet and make the neighborhood feel suspended. My driveway was already dusted over, and the yard looked smooth, untouched and safe in that way snow can trick you into believing. Then a dark oval dented the white near my fence line, clean and crisp, the exact shape of a boot tread, pressed fresh into powder. I leaned closer without thinking, and a second footprint appeared a few feet beside it, perfectly spaced, like a normal stride. My brain tried to label it as someone walking by outside my view, but the problem was my view. The fence line is open from my window. There's no blind spot that would hide a full-grown person for those 10 feet of lawn. I could see the entire stretch of snow where the prints were forming. And yet, I never saw a body. I never saw a leg lift a boot, swing, a figure move through the falling flakes. I only saw the evidence of weight touching down in sequence, one imprint at a time, like an invisible person was walking across my yard, and the snow was the only thing willing to admit it. I felt my throat tighten and forced myself to step back from the glass because the instinct to press my face to a window in a snowstorm suddenly felt like the dumbest invitation a person can make. Another print appeared, then another angling toward the back of my house. I grabbed my phone and started recording, not because I believed it would help, but because I needed to prove to myself I wasn't hallucinating. Through the camera lens, the yard looked flatter, the flakes more like static, but the prints were obvious dark depressions with crisp edges that hadn't had time to soften. Then the next part happened, the part that still makes my skin crawl. When I think about it, the earliest footprints began to fill in. Not drift over slowly like normal snowfall, but fill like a cup being poured into. Snow seemed to slide into the impressions from nowhere, smoothing them over in seconds until they looked untouched again. The first print that had appeared near the fence line was gone before the invisible walker reached the halfway point. It wasn't erasing behind them in a natural way. It was being covered fast enough to hide the path, like whatever was moving wanted no trail, and the storm was cooperating. I watched in disbelief as the sequence continued. A new print would appear sharp and fresh. Then, within moments, it would lighten, soften, and level out, returning the yard to blankness. It was like a magic trick performed in silence, and the silence was the worst part. No crunch of boots, no branches snapping, nothing but the hush of snowfall and the quiet click of my own heartbeat in my ears. The prints advanced toward my back steps, and the ones behind them disappeared almost immediately, leaving only 2 or 3 visible at a time. If you looked away for a second, you'd miss the whole story, and the yard would look pristine again. My hands started shaking so hard the video wobbled. I stopped recording long enough to call 911 because I realized what this meant in the simplest, ugliest way. Someone could cross my yard during active snowfall and leave almost nothing behind. And if I hadn't been standing here at the exact moment, I never would have known. The dispatcher's voice was calm. I told her I was watching footprints appear in my yard without seeing anyone, and that the prints were filling in as they formed. There was a pause, just long enough for me to feel ridiculous, and then she said, "Are you alone in the house?" I said yes. She told me to lock my doors and stay away from windows. I walked through the house on autopilot, deadbolting the back door and checking the slider, but my eyes kept snapping back to the glass. When I returned to the kitchen window, the prints had reached the base of my back steps. 2 fresh dents appeared on the bottom step, then a third on the porch boards where snow had drifted thinly into corners. The porch light flicked on automatically bright and harsh, but it lit only emptiness and falling flakes. The steps remained marked by impressions that deepened, as if someone had shifted their weight that waiting. Then one by one those impressions filled in too, as if snow was being brushed or poured into them from above. I realized with a cold clarity that the storm wasn't just hiding this person. It was actively cleaning for them. I backed into the hallway where I couldn't see the porch and listened. Nothing. No handle jiggle. No knock. Just the furnace and the faint tick of settling wood. Then very softly, I heard a scrape on the porch boards, like rubber against wet paint. One sound controlled minimal, as if someone was testing the door without using their hands. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The scrape came again closer to the deadbolt area, then stopped. Minutes later, sirens approached, muffled by snow. Blue lights washed across my living room walls, and the sound of tires crunching into the curb felt like reality returning. When the officers arrived, they walked my yard with flashlights angled low, but by then the storm had done its work. The only prints still visible were 2 shallow depressions at the base of the steps that looked like nothing more than uneven settling. I showed them the video. They watched in silence, the younger officer's jaw tightening as each print appeared and then vanished under fast-filling snow. He rewound it twice, like he was trying to catch the moment a body should be visible. The older officer asked if I had cameras. I did. The backyard camera feed showed nothing but swirling flakes, and a brief glitch at the exact time my video began, like the sensor had been overwhelmed or blocked. The officers checked the porch and the doors. Everything was locked. They searched the perimeter, but falling snow had flattened the yard into innocence again. Before they left, the older officer said something that didn't make me feel better. He said storms are perfect for people who know what they're doing, because snow doesn't just cover footprints, it changes the timeline. It turns evidence into a race. If you don't see it immediately, you never see it at all. That night, the snow kept falling, and my yard stayed smooth and clean, and that should have been comforting. Instead, I sat in the hallway with my phone in my hand, because I couldn't stop thinking about how close the invisible prints had gotten, how the last step had reached my door, and how the snow had filled in behind them like a hand wiping a pro. Window clean. In the morning, there was no trail to follow, no proof to show a neighbor, no reason anyone would believe me if I hadn't filmed it. Just a perfect blanket of fresh snow outside my back door, and the sick understanding that someone had walked right up to my home while I watched, and the storm had erased them in real time. The tracks ended in the middle of my yard, and the man was standing exactly where they stopped, as if he'd stepped out of the snow and decided to become part of the landscape. I saw him through the upstairs window, before my brain could translate what my eyes were giving me. A lone figure, in a dark coat shoulders, dusted, white face lifted toward my house, perfectly still. Beneath him, a line of fresh boot prints cut across the yard from the woods to his feet. The prints were deep and crisp, and they ended cleanly at the toes of his boots, with no turnaround and no scatter, like he'd walked straight to that spot and then simply paused to wait for me to notice. The storm had stopped overnight, leaving a hard, quiet morning where every sound felt amplified. The neighborhood was muffled under new snow, and the sky was that bright winter gray that makes everything look exposed. I should have felt safer in daylight. Instead, the sight of him standing there made my stomach drop because it was the nightmare version of the earlier logic. Before the tracks ended, and I had to imagine where the person went. Now the tracks ended, and the answer was looking back at me. I didn't open the blinds fully. I didn't put my face to the glass. I watched through a narrow seam, the way you watch a predator through tall grass. He didn't wave. He didn't shift. He just stood at the end of his own footprints, like the conclusion of a story. I moved slowly through the house and checked locks, even though I knew the locks weren't the point. The point was that he had placed himself in my yard with an exit-free trail behind him, and he was acting like he belonged there. I grabbed my phone and called 911, whispering as if sound could leak through walls. I told the dispatcher there was a man standing in my yard at the end of a line of footprints that led from the woods and did not lead away. She asked if he was trying to enter. I said he wasn't moving at all, and that somehow made it worse. While I stayed on the line, I kept watching him. Snowflakes drifted off the branches in the woods behind him, and a faint breeze stirred the yard, but he remained motionless, almost patient. Then he did something small that felt enormous. He lifted his chin slightly, and I realized he wasn't just staring at the house. He was staring at my window. Not the general shape of my home, not the front door, not the driveway. My window. The seam where I was hiding behind blinds. His eyes found the exact place my face would be if I were careless. My chest tightened. I backed away from the window and stood in the hallway where I couldn't see him, as if not seeing him would make him less real. A minute passed, then another. The dispatcher told me officers were on the way, and to stay inside. I told her I would, but my body kept wanting to creep back to the window because fear has that terrible magnetism. When I looked again, he was still there, but now I could see the way snow had accumulated on his shoulders and hat. That meant he'd been standing still for a while, long enough for the falling powder from the night's calm to settle on him and make him look partially coated like a statue that had been outdoors too long. The idea of him standing in my yard through the dark hours, not moving, just waiting for morning, made my skin crawl in a way I can't properly explain. It wasn't the threat of sudden violence. It was the intimacy of someone choosing to be near your home for no practical reason except proximity. The sirens arrived, and the sound seemed to pull the world into sharper focus. I watched from the side window as 2 squad cars stopped, and officers stepped out their boots, crunching loudly on the snow. The man didn't run. He didn't flinch. He remained in place at the end of the tracks, as if he had expected them to. One officer called out, voice firm, commanding him to show his hands. The man slowly raised his arms, palms forward, and for the first time I saw his gloves were wet and dark as if he'd been handling snow or metal. The officers approached, cautiously, spreading out to flank him. I expected him to comply, to be cuffed, to turn into a normal police story. Instead, he took one slow step backward, one without breaking eye contact with the upstairs window. That step landed in fresh snow and created a new print behind him. Then he took another step backward, carefully placing his boot into the exact same impression he'd just made, as if he was trying to minimize his trail. It was such a controlled movement, so deliberate, that it didn't look like retreat. It looked like demonstration. The officer shouted again, sharper this time, and moved faster. The man paused, and then did something that made the whole scene tilt into unreality. He stepped backward into the shadow of the tree line and seemed to dissolve into it. Not vanish in a supernatural way, not blink out. He simply moved into the woods at the one angle where branches and darkness swallowed him, and he did it so cleanly the officers lost him for a half second. A half second is all it takes in winter woods. They sprinted boots, punching new holes into the snow, and I watched them follow the line of prints to where it met the trees. But the chase stalled almost immediately because the man had done what he came to do. He had controlled the story the snow told. His original track line still ended in my yard. The new backward steps were almost invisible because he'd placed them inside his own impressions. And in the tree line where wind and falling powder had sifted through the branches, the snow was disturbed in a way that looked like nothing. The officers searched with flashlights, but daylight in winter woods is deceptive. It makes every shadow look like a hiding place, and every hiding place look like a trick of light. After several minutes they came back, frustrated. One officer walked up to my door and asked if I could come outside. I cracked it only enough to speak. He asked how long the man had been there. I told him I saw him as soon as I looked out. He nodded and looked back at the tracks, then up at my window. Then he said quietly he wanted you to see him. They examined the footprints and confirmed they came from the woods and ended in my yard with no normal exit. The officer explained what I already felt in my bones. A person can enter from the woods, walk across open snow, and then leave by stepping perfectly back into their own prints until they reach cover, making it look like they never left at all. Snow doesn't just record what happened. It can be manipulated to suggest what didn't. Before the officer left, he pointed at the end of the track line, where the man had stood. "This spot," he said. "This is where he wanted you to look." Then he asked if anything had been moved outside, cars, trash bins, gate latches. I checked and found my side gate unlatched, even though I always keep it closed. It wasn't wide open. It was just unhooked, like someone had tested it and left it for later. That tiny detail landed heavier than the entire chase, because it suggested the man didn't come for a single moment. He came to set conditions. That night, I couldn't stop replaying the way he stood in the yard and looked straight at the slit in my blinds. The next morning, fresh snow had fallen again, softening the yard into a clean sheet. The original track line was gone. The end spot where he had stood looked ordinary. If you didn't know what to look for, you'd never guess someone had been there. But I knew, and now every time I see footprints in snow, I don't just follow them to see where they go. I ask myself what it means when they stop. Because sometimes the answer isn't on the roof or in the attic or under the house. Sometimes the answer is a person standing perfectly still at the end of the trail, waiting for you to look out and confirm that the snow wasn't the only thing watching your home. I thought I was being smart when I decided to follow the tracks. The police had already told me the same thing. Everyone says in winter, don't go out alone, don't confront, don't play hero. But standing inside my warm house, staring at a line of fresh footprints that began under the trees and ended at my back fence, did something to my brain. It turned fear into a problem I wanted to solve. The prints weren't scattered. They were clean, boot, treads deep, and even spaced with a calm stride, and they didn't wander the yard like someone was lost. They followed the property line until they reached the gate latch, then stopped, as if the person had stood there long enough to test it. The latch itself looked normal from a distance, but up close the snow around it was pressed flat, and there was a thin scratch on the metal, where something had nudged it without opening it. Right beside that pause point, a second line of prints began, and angled away from my yard back toward the woods. It looked like a return route. It looked like an invitation. I should have let the snow keep it secret, but I pulled on boots, shoved my phone into my pocket and stepped outside with my heart hammering. The cold was sharp enough to make my breath feel metallic. The neighborhood was quiet, muffled under new snow, and every crunch of my boots sounded like a flare. I followed the return line toward the tree line, staying a foot to the side so I wouldn't crush tread detail. Each print was the same depth. No limp, no stumble, no hurry. As the tracks reached the trees, the snow under the branches thinned and the light changed, turning the ground into a patchwork of gray and shadow. A few yards in, I noticed another pattern riding alongside the boot tread's shallow drag marks that appeared every few steps, intermittent, as if something had been pulled and then lifted again. It wasn't heavy enough to gouge deep, but it was consistent enough to mean intention. My stomach tightened. This wasn't just someone walking. This was someone carrying something. The track line bent behind a stand of pines and opened into a small clearing I'd never noticed from the road. In the center sat a low dome shape, half buried under snow. Atop, dark nylon edges crusted with frost guylines disappearing under powder like roots. It was muted, the color of wet bark, designed to be overlooked. I stopped so suddenly, my boots slid. Near the entrance, a rectangle of snow had been smoothed flat like a doormat. On that smooth patch were smaller impressions, not the same boot tread I'd followed, as if someone had stood there in socks or bare feet before stepping back inside. The details felt intimate in a way that made my mouth go dry. I didn't approach. The idea that a person might be inches away behind a thin wall of fabric made my skin tighten. I raised my phone to zoom in, and that's when I saw the detail that turned my fear into certainty. A faint curl of condensation drifting from a seam near the top, so light it looked like the tent was exhaling. Warm breath. Recent. Maybe current. I backed away one step at a time, trying to place my boots into my own footprints so I wouldn't create a second trail that led straight to my front door. Halfway back toward the tree line, I heard the smallest sound behind me, nylon, shifting. Not a zipper, just the tent skin moving, as if someone inside had leaned closer to listen to me leaving. That was enough. I didn't run. Running makes noise. Running makes you predictable. I walked faster, heart pounding, and the moment I broke out of the trees and saw my house again, it felt like surfacing from deep water. Inside, I locked the door and called 911 with my voice low and tight. I told the dispatcher I'd followed footprints from my yard into the woods and found a tent in a clearing that looked occupied. She told me to stay inside and keep away from windows. Officers arrived quickly, and I showed them the tracks at the fence and the direction they led. I admitted embarrassed and terrified that I'd followed them already. The older officer didn't scold me. He just looked at the woods with a hard expression and said, "This is why we tell people not to do that," and called for a K9. I watched from my front window as they walked the trail, scanning the tree line. The dog pulled hard toward the clearing, body rigid, tail straight. When they reached the tent, the officers formed a half circle and called out commands. The tent didn't move. The dog growled low, a sound that made my arms prickle because it sounded like certainty. One officer approached and used his baton to press the tent wall. The fabric gave slightly, and something shifted inside. "Occupant," the officer said into his radio, calm the way people get when they're forcing their own nerves down. The zipper moved. A hand appeared first, pale against dark fabric, followed by a face that looked more tired than surprised. The man crawled out slowly, with his hands raised. He didn't bolt. He didn't plead. He looked toward my house like he was checking if I was watching, and I hated how practiced that look. Felt like he had already seen me in his head 100 times. They cuffed him and searched the tent. Inside was a flattened sleeping pad, a damp blanket, hand warmers, empty snack wrappers, and a cheap phone mount on a small tripod pointed through the trees at the angle of my backyard. There was also a small pouch of zip ties and a roll of tape, not dramatic on their own, just ordinary enough to be terrifying in the wrong hands. They pulled out binoculars, a cheap radio scanner, and a notebook sealed in plastic. One officer flipped through the notebook and his face changed. He didn't show me the pages, but he asked me carefully, "Do you live alone?" Later he told me the notebook listed addresses and routines, and next to mine was a note that read like a reminder, "Back door, lights out." Under it he had written a time, and next to that time a note about a faint TV glow in my living room, like he'd been watching my windows long enough to learn my habits. There were pages describing where cameras pointed which windows had blinds, and a crude sketch of my fence gate with the words "Quiet Latch" underlined. The officer said my address wasn't the only one in the book, but mine had the most notes, which meant I hadn't just been noticed, I had been studied. It wasn't just my house either. It was days of the week notes about cars in driveways, notes about when porch lights clicked off, the kind of details you only collect by returning again and again. That night, new snow fell and erased the path between my fence and that clearing until the woods looked innocent again. But I couldn't stop replaying the moment I saw that thin curl of breath rise from the tent seam, because it taught me a winter rule I never had before. When footprints lead away from your house, don't assume you're watching someone leave. Sometimes you're seeing where they have been close enough to wait. One morning I walked outside, and my car looked cared for. The windshield was scraped clear, the side windows were brushed clean, and the roof had been swept down to bare paint, as if someone had taken their time to make it easy for me to leave. For a split second I felt that warm, foolish gratitude you feel when you think a neighbor did you a favor. Then I noticed the snow on the ground. My driveway, my steps, even the path to my mailbox was still smooth and untouched. The only disturbed area was around my car, a neat ring of boot prints and broad brushstrokes where snow had been pushed aside. I stepped closer, and the gratitude died. The tires weren't just low, they were flat, all four. The rubber collapsed into the snow like the car had sunk. I crouched and saw thin, clean cuts along the sidewalls, too straight to be accidental. Whoever scraped my windows had also ruined my ability to drive away. The gesture felt deliberate and cruel. Make me step outside, make me think help was close, then take my escape. I looked back at the boot prints, trying to find the exit trail, because the rule with winter fear is simple. If there are no footprints leaving, the person is still close. The prints approached from my side yard, circled the vehicle once, then paused, longest, at the driver's door. In that spot, the snow was churned into an oval where someone had stood still and worked. Right beside that oval were tiny black specks. When I leaned in, I realized it was rubber dust from the slashes, like the ground itself was confirming what my eyes didn't want to accept. There was no clear trail back to the street, no line leading to the sidewalk. The prints simply faded at the corner of my garage where my camera can't see, as if the person had stepped into that shadow and stopped being a person. I turned, slowly, scanning the hedges, the gap between houses, the tree line behind the fence. Everything looked empty. That emptiness didn't calm me. It sharpened the logic he had chosen the blind spot on purpose, and the snow had helped him by making the absence of a trail feel like a message. I went back inside without touching the car door, locked the deadbolt, and called 911. I told the dispatcher someone had cleared the snow off my car and slashed all four tires, and there was one set of footprints around the vehicle with no obvious exit trail. She asked if I saw anyone. I said no, but I didn't believe they were gone. She told me to stay inside, keep away from windows, and wait for officers. While I waited, I pulled up my doorbell camera footage. At 2:10 M, The motion sensor triggered and a hooded figure walked up my driveway, carrying a long-handled snow brush, the kind that looks harmless and familiar. They started brushing the roof with steady strokes, clearing the windshield in neat arcs, like they were doing a neighborly chore. The hood and the angle hid their face, but the movement was calm, practiced, almost gentle. Then the figure crouched by the front tire and made a quick, precise motion with one hand. They moved to the next tire and repeated it. No wild stabbing, no anger, just a sequence like checking boxes. When they finished the fourth tire, they stood at my driver's door for a moment and tilted their head toward the house, as if listening for any change inside. After that, the figure stepped behind the car and vanished from the camera's view. The feed stayed active another minute, but showed only falling snow. No retreat down the driveway. No departure toward the street. It was as if the person had simply folded themselves into the shadow beside my garage and waited for morning to deliver the reaction. When officers arrived, I showed them the cuts and the footage. One officer watched it twice and said, "This wasn't random vandalism. This was control." He explained that clearing the windows creates a reason for someone to go outside fast, distracted, focused on the car instead of the yard. Slashing the tires keeps you in place and forces you to call for help, which creates predictable timing. The snow brush was camouflage. If anyone glanced out, they'd assume it was a neighbor, not a threat. They studied the boot prints and then looked at the tire grooves under the car. My car had been parked before the storm, so the snow had settled into shallow channels around the tires. "He used these," the older officer said, pointing. Along the narrow trough, beside the tire tracks, were faint compressed lines where someone had stepped inside the existing grooves, using them like a track to hide their departure. From a distance, it would look like the footprints simply stopped. Snow didn't just record him. It helped him edit himself out. The officers searched the blind spot by the garage and found a snapped utility blade half buried near the gate, the kind you'd use to open boxes. Next to it was a shallow palm press in the snow, like someone had steadied themselves while slipping it away. They bagged it and asked if I recognized it. I didn't. That was the point. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't dropped by chance. It was the tool of someone who came prepared, did exactly what they intended, and left as little behind as possible. A tow truck came that afternoon, and I had to stand in my doorway while a stranger chained my car like it was broken livestock. The driver joked about winter surprises, like it was a normal inconvenience. I nodded and pretended to smile, but my eyes kept jumping to the corner of the garage, where the camera couldn't see, because now that corner felt like a hiding place. A pocket in the world where a person could exist without being recorded. When the tow operator lifted the car, the underside came into view, and I felt something twist in my chest. The place I'd been leaning over, the place I would have knelt to check the tires if I'd been half asleep, and trusting was exact where someone could have stayed low and close. Before the officers left, one of them told me something I didn't want to hear but needed. The goal might not have been the tires. The goal might have been to shape my behavior, to force me outside at a predictable time to test whether I would open the door, whether I would step into the blind spot, whether I would bend down and stay there long enough to be vulnerable. "Treat this like someone is learning you," he said. Change the routine. That night, snow started again, softening the boot prints until they blurred into nothing. By morning, the driveway looked almost normal, and that was the part that haunted me. Winter doesn't just hide people. It rewrites the scene. If I hadn't walked out at the right moment, I might have assumed the tires went flat on their own, that the cleared windows were a kindness, that there was no story at all. But I saw the truth in the snow. Someone came close enough to touch my car, close enough to keep me here, and close enough to leave without leaving a trail that proved they ever existed. The shop confirmed the cuts were fresh made with a utility blade. I adjusted my camera to cover the garage corner, but the part that stayed with me was the snow brush. It looked like kindness. It was bait. By noon, the driveway looked harmless again, and that made it worse. The two sets of tracks didn't just tell me someone had been in my yard. They told me there were two people, and only one of them was moving willingly. I noticed it because the snow made it impossible to lie to myself. One line of prints was heavy, deep boot tread, the kind that punches clean ovals into fresh powder with confident spacing. The other line wasn't really footprints at all. It was a dragged path, shallow, smeared, uneven like heels, scraping in toes, catching, like someone being pulled along while their feet kept trying to find the ground. The heavy prints came from the tree line. They crossed the yard in a straight shot toward my back patio. The dragged marks began halfway across, right where the snow was scuffed, into a rough patch, as if there'd been a struggle or a lift. From that point on, both trails ran together, boots beside drag, step beside smear, moving toward my house with a rhythm that felt wrong. The boot prints stayed consistent. The drag marks changed, sometimes narrower, sometimes wider, sometimes showing the faint outline of a sole for half a second before becoming a smear again. It looked like someone alternated between trying to walk and being yanked forward. The trail ended at my basement bulkhead doors, not at the main door where lights and cameras are, not at a window where you might notice. It ended at the side entrance nobody thinks about, the door you only use to carry storage bins or shovel salt in winter. Both trails stopped there. No loop back to the yard. No return route to the woods. Just the heavy prints and the dragged smears pressed into the snow up to the last step, as if two people reached my basement, and then the story was cut off. I stood at my kitchen window, staring at that frozen evidence, and felt the horrible logic click into place. If there are no tracks leaving, then either they went inside, or they're still close enough that they don't need to leave yet. I didn't go outside. I didn't touch the bulkhead. I didn't even turn on the basement light, because the idea of illuminating that stairwell felt like opening a stage curtain. I called 911 and said very carefully that I had 2 sets of tracks leading to my basement, 1 set of heavy boot prints and 1 set of drag marks, both ending at the bulkhead with no exit trail. The dispatcher asked if anyone else lived with me. I said no. She told me to lock myself in a room away from the basement and wait for officers. I tried to do what she said, but my body wouldn't stop listening. When you know something ended at a door in your house, you start hearing the house like it's a person. The furnace cycling becomes footsteps. The pipes shifting become whispers. Every tiny vibration in the floor becomes proof that something below is moving. Then I heard a sound that wasn't my imagination. A soft, irregular scrape from the basement stairwell, like rubber dragged over concrete. It came once, paused, then came again longer, this time like something being pulled a few inches, and then stopped. I backed into the hallway and stayed there, phone in my hand, because I couldn't stand near the basement door without picturing the dragged marks outside. When the officers arrived, they didn't treat the tracks like a prank. They walked the path in silence, crouching where the dragged marks began shining, flashlights low even though it was daylight, because daylight doesn't show texture the way a beam does. One officer traced the heavy boot prints with his finger and said, "Single tread, consistent stride." Then he moved to the dragged marks, and his face tightened. "This isn't a sled," he said. "No runner line. This is feet." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. They checked the bulkhead doors. The padlock was still in place, but the metal had a thin film of moisture, and the shackle looked slightly rotated, like it had been handled recently with warm hands or gloves. One officer asked if I'd been in the basement lately. I said no. He nodded like that was what he expected. They used bolt cutters on the lock. The snap of metal sounded too loud in the winter quiet. When they lifted the bulkhead doors, a cold breath rose from the stairwell, damp and sour, and the flashlight beams cut down into darkness. The first thing they saw was the smear on the steps, a long streak that ran along the concrete like something wet had been dragged down and then paused. The officers went down, slowly calling out weapons, drawn voices firm. I stayed at the top behind them because my body refused to cross that threshold. From where I stood, I could see the basement floor in pieces, boxes, shelves, a workbench, until the flashlight found something near the far wall that made one officer freeze. It was a coil of rope, not a messy coil like you'd find in a toolbox. A neat coil staged. Beside it sat a strip of duct tape, already torn into short lengths, and stuck to the edge of a table for quick grabbing. And on the concrete beneath that table was a fresh, damp footprint, bare smeared, as if a foot had stepped in meltwater and then slid. The officer turned his head and said, "We're not alone." Then everything moved at once. A sharp shuffle came from behind a stack of storage bins, and a figure bolted toward the far corner where my basement window well sits. The officers shouted. The figure slipped, recovered, and tried to wedge into the shadow behind the furnace, where the light struggled to reach. They tackled him before he could disappear, and in the brief chaos of bodies and flashlight beams, I saw the detail that made my stomach drop harder than anything. His boots were the same tread as the heavy prints outside, but one boot was unlaced and half off, as if he'd been in a hurry. The officers cuffed him and asked if anyone else was down there. He kept glancing toward the corner behind the shelving unit, eyes flicking like he was checking whether something had been left behind. One officer searched that corner and then called out, "Found a crawl gap." Behind the shelving was a small access, opening to the undisturbed void, a cramped space I'd never used. The flashlight beam slid inside and caught a second presence. Not a person standing, not a face at first, just a pale shape low to the ground pressed tight against the wall. When the officer spoke again, his voice changed into something careful. "Hey," he said, "calmer now, you can come out." There was a pause, and then a soft, weak movement, like someone trying to comply without strength. A second person crawled out slowly, hands trembling, socks soaked, and grey one ankle wrapped in torn fabric, like an improvised bandage. They weren't making eye contact. They looked like someone pulled out of a place they didn't choose. The officers guided them up the stairs, while another officer kept the first man pinned to the basement floor. Outside, the snow still held the story, heavy boots beside dragged feet straight to my basement. Inside, the story was worse, because it had props. The rope, the tape, the staged corner, the hidden gap. It felt less like a random crime and more like a planned room where winter was part of the design. Later, an officer told me the drag marks could have been caused by someone being forced forward while trying to keep their footing, or someone too exhausted to lift their feet properly. He said the heavy prints staying steady the entire time was the detail that mattered most, because it meant the person pulling was never struggling to move. That night, snow began again, soft and patient, filling in the dragged smears first because they were shallow, erasing the helplessness before it erased the confidence. By morning, the yard looked cleaner than it had any right to, but I couldn't unsee the geometry of it. 2 trails entering my life, only one setting control, and both ending at the one door in my house I'd stopped paying attention to. That's what winter taught me with those tracks. Not that someone can come to your home, that someone can bring someone else with them, and the snow will faithfully record the difference between a step and a drag. The boots were sitting in the middle of my backyard, like a gift, perfectly upright, toes pointed toward my house, laces loose, empty. They were black work boots, scuffed at the heel, the kind you'd expect to see on someone shoveling a driveway. But nobody in my house owned boots like that, and nobody had been in my yard overnight except whoever left those tracks. I saw them from the upstairs window and felt my stomach tighten, because the snow around them told a story that didn't make sense at first glance. A single line of footprints crossed the yard, from the tree line to the spot where the boots sat. The prints were clear boot treads that matched the shape of the abandoned pair. The trail ended at the boots, and then nothing. No continuation, no turnaround, no second trail heading back. Just boots placed neatly in clean snow, and an abrupt end to the evidence, like the person had walked to that spot and then ceased to exist. My brain immediately hunted for the missing piece. If the person took their boots off, there should be barefoot prints. If they put on different shoes, there should be different tread. If they climbed away, there should be marks, scuffs, near the fence disturbance at the downspout, a trough on the roofline. But the yard beyond the boots was pristine, and what made it worse was the placement. The boots were directly beneath my kitchen window, in the exact patch of yard I glance at when I make coffee. Whoever left them didn't just want to leave something behind. They wanted me to see it early in daylight, while the snow was still crisp enough to make the absence scream. I didn't go outside. I called 911 and told the dispatcher there were boots sitting in my backyard with a single set of tracks leading to them and no tracks leaving. She asked if I could see anyone. I said no. and I could hear how unbelievable my own sentence sounded. "Stay inside," she said, "and don't go near the windows." That advice felt impossible because the boots were an anchor for my eyes. Every time I moved, my gaze wanted to snap back to the spot where the tracks ended. While I waited for officers, I checked my camera feed. The backyard camera had recorded mostly snowfall and darkness, but at 4:06 a.m., motion triggered, and a hooded figure stepped into frame at the edge of the yard. They walked straight to the window line, stopped, and looked up. Even through grainy infrared, I could see their head tilt, as if they were confirming the room layout. Then they crouched. For almost a minute, their bodies stayed low and still, hands moving near their feet. When they stood again, the boots were gone from their feet because the boots were now on the ground. They didn't throw them. They didn't kick them aside. They placed them neatly upright aligned. Then the figure backed away, one slow step at a time, and this is where the footage turned my stomach into ice. They didn't walk away like a normal person. They stepped backward into their own footprints, with careful precision, placing each foot into the exact depressions they'd already made. To the snow, it would look like one person walked in and stopped. To anyone watching casually, it would look like the person never left. On camera, it looked like someone undoing their own existence. When the figure reached the shadow of the tree line, they slid sideways into darkness without making any new marks in open snow. The motion sensor stopped, and the yard returned to empty. The boots remained as proof, and the snow remained as a lie. The officers arrived and studied the scene the way you study something you don't want to understand. One officer walked the track line to the boots and stopped, eyes scanning the snow for any continuation. He circled the boots without stepping too close, then looked at me and said, he backtracked. He said it like it was a known trick, a method. Another officer examined the boots with a flashlight and noticed fine snow crystals clinging inside the ankle opening like they'd been worn recently and then exposed. They also found a faint drag in the snow beside the boots, a shallow smear that didn't match a footstep. The officer pointed at it and said, "He moved something here." I felt my throat close. What I asked, and the officer didn't answer directly. He just looked up at my window, then at my side gate, then at the corner of my house, where the downspout runs, as if he was mapping potential routes someone could take without leaving new tracks. They checked my fence line and found a narrow spot where the snow on the top rail had been brushed away in a clean strip like a gloved hand had gripped it. That could mean the person left by climbing the fence, but if they did, there should have been a landing mark on the other side. There wasn't. They checked my downspout and found a vertical smear where frost had been rubbed off, but the ground beneath it was untouched, as if whoever climbed had stepped from something else. The officers didn't say it, but the implication landed. Anyway, backtracking wasn't the only trick. Sometimes people combine tricks. Walk in, erase your exit by walking backward, then leave above ground level where snow can't record you properly. The boots weren't left because they were unwanted. They were left because they were useful. A decoy for dogs, a decoy for witnesses, a symbol meant to unsettle. People do this to mess with you, the older officer said, voice flat, to make you doubt what you saw. That was the most honest part, because it worked. Even with video, my brain still tried to argue. Boots don't appear in a yard by themselves. Footprints don't end without a body. And yet the snow outside was insisting on an impossible conclusion. The officers took the boots as evidence. When one of them lifted a boot, packed snow fell out of the soled tread and made a tiny scatter on the ground. A brief new mark that looked like a signature. Under the boot was a small circular depression in the snow, where the heel had been pressed down harder than the toe, like whoever set it there had leaned weight into it deliberately as if anchoring it in place. After the police left, I stood at my kitchen window, staring at the bare patch where the boots had been, and the yard looked almost normal again. The track line was already softening under a light new dusting. By evening it would be gone. That's the part that stays with me. Snow erases the path, and your mind tries to erase the fear with it. But the fear doesn't leave because the boots weren't just an object. They were a demonstration. A person can come to your home, place something under your window like a message, and then remove their exit from the story the snow tells. They can make it look like they are still there or never there, or both at once. And once you've seen a pair of boots, sitting neatly in the snow with no tracks leaving, you stop trusting the clean white outside your windows. You start treating it like a page someone else can edit quietly, carefully while you sleep. The footprints didn't stop at my front door. They stopped at my peep-hole. That's the detail that turned a normal winter nuisance into something that sat in my chest like a stone. Because a front door is a boundary, but a peep-hole is an invitation to look, and someone had used mine like it belonged to them. I noticed the tracks. First one clean line of boot prints coming from the sidewalk, up my porch steps, and ending directly in front of the door in a tight cluster. Toes pointed inward, as if the person had leaned close and stayed there. The snow was fresh enough that the tread pattern was still sharp and the cluster was deep, like someone had stood still for a while, shifting their weight, waiting for something on the other side. There were no prints leading away, none down the steps, none back to the sidewalk. Just the approach and the pause, like the story, ended at my door and refused to continue. I didn't open it. I didn't even touch the knob. I stayed behind the door with my heart hammering and looked through the peephole from the inside, and the glass was fogged. Not the outside glass, not the storm window. My peephole lens, the tiny round eye in the door, was clouded with a thin film of condensation as if someone had just breathed on it. The fog slowly thinned, revealing a warped fisheye view of my porch. Empty boards, a faint drift in the corner, and the pale circle of snow where the boot cluster sat. The emptiness should have relieved me. It didn't, because peepholes don't fog from inside, unless the air inside is humid, and mine was dry. Peepholes fog when warm breath touches the outside lens. Peepholes fog when a face is inches from your door. I stood there not breathing and stared at the little circle as if it might fog again and prove I wasn't imagining it. That's when I saw the second detail, a thin scratch around the peephole ring, fresh, bright, against the dull brass, like someone had tried to twist the assembly. My door has a small flip cover on the inside of the peephole, a privacy cap that I almost never use. That morning it was open. I know it was open because I never leave it open. I don't even remember the last time I touched it. Yet there it was, flipped up like a lid someone had checked. My mouth went dry. I backed away from the door and called 911 voice low, explaining that I had fresh footprints to my front door with no tracks leaving, and my peephole was fogged and scratched like it had been tampered with. The dispatcher didn't laugh. She asked if I was alone, if the door was locked, if I could stay away from windows until officers arrived. I moved to the hallway and sat on the floor, with my back against the wall, because sitting felt safer than standing near a surface someone could watch through. Every few seconds, my eyes snapped back to the door, like it might change. The house was quiet in that winter way, no traffic, no birds, just the faint click of heat cycling. And then, very softly, I heard something on the other side of the door, a faint tick like a fingernail tapping metal right where the peephole sits. It happened once, paused, then happened again, slower, like someone was testing where the sound traveled. My whole body locked. I didn't move. I didn't make a noise. I couldn't tell if the person was still there, or if the sound was my own mind, but the peephole fogging earlier had already convinced me that my mind wasn't the problem. The next sound was worse because it was unmistakably physical. A tiny scrape, circular, like something being turned against the peephole housing. It lasted half a second, stopped, then started again. The idea that someone was unscrewing the peephole from the outside made my throat tighten so hard it felt like I couldn't swallow. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher and whispered that I could hear someone working at my door. She told me officers were close and to stay where I was. I heard sirens in the distance, muffled by snow, and the sound felt like oxygen. Then the scraping stopped. The porch went silent, the kind of silent that feels deliberate. When the officers arrived, their boots made loud, honest crunches on the steps, and I didn't realize how starved I was for normal sound until I heard it. I opened the door only when an officer was standing there, and even then I kept the chain on. He took one look at the boot cluster and the way it had dug into the snow, and said, "He stood here." Another officer crouched by the doorframe and pointed to something I hadn't noticed, a faint dusting of white powder clinging to the peephole ring outside, as if frost had been disturbed by warm hands or breath. He lifted his flashlight and angled it across the brass. "Tool marks," he said, voice flat. He asked if I had any cameras. My doorbell camera faced the porch, but snow had been falling, and the footage was a smear of flakes and light. Still, when we scrubbed back to 338 A.M., the camera caught a hooded figure stepping up onto the porch and standing directly in front of the door. They didn't knock. They didn't ring the bell. They leaned in close face near the peephole and stayed there. For nearly a full minute, they didn't move, like they were listening to the house breathe. Then their hands came up, and even with grainy infrared, I could see the careful motion of fingers turning something small. The camera didn't catch the exact tool, but the movement was precise, controlled, not frantic. After a moment, the figure leaned back and looked straight at the camera like they knew it was watching, and the angle of their head made it seem like they were smiling. Then they stepped to the side out of the doorbell's view, into the narrow strip by the porch column where the camera can't see. The footage continued, showing an empty porch, while snow fell for another 30 seconds. Then the figure returned, briefly bent close to the peephole again, and then this is the part that made my stomach go cold. The peephole image on the inside of my door caught a flicker of movement in real time. A shadow passed over the lens from the outside, and the glass fogged again, as if someone had leaned close and breathed once slow. I hadn't noticed it then, because I was asleep, but seeing the fog happen on camera, seeing the timing made it feel like a performance. The officers inspected my peephole from inside and outside. The older officer gently tried to twist the assembly, and it moved slightly loose in a way it shouldn't be. He told me to step back, then used a small tool to remove it fully. The peephole lens came out in two pieces. The inside ring, the part that should face my eye, had been reversed. Someone had turned my door's one-way window into a two-way idea. The officer held it up and said he wanted to see in without you seeing out. He showed me a faint smear on the lens edge, oily like skin. Then he did something that made the air in my hallway feel thinner. He shined a flashlight through the peephole opening, and the beam didn't come out as a tight circle like it normally would. It scattered oddly, as if something had been placed in the housing that didn't belong. Something cheap, something improvised. They found it a minute later, tucked between the outer ring and the door skin, a tiny wafer-thin plastic disc, like part of a toy camera lens, and a strip of black tape used to seal gaps. It wasn't a perfect spy device. It was worse, because it was personal. Someone had been close enough to my door to modify it by hand, in the snow in the dark while I slept. When the officers stepped outside to search the porch columns in the side of the house, they found a single additional mark in the snow near the porch rail, a scuff line, and a shallow depression where someone had likely stepped sideways off. The boards into the existing boot cluster then backtracked down the steps by placing their feet into their own prints, leaving no new trail. It was the same editing trick Winter makes possible: arrive, linger, then erase your departure by using your own evidence as camouflage. Before they left, the older officer told me to replace the peephole entirely, not just tighten it. Treat this like a breach, he said. Not because he got inside, but because he got access to how you see. That line stayed with me, because for days afterward, every time I walked past the front door, I felt the urge to cover the peephole with my palm, like a child. Covers their eyes, as if not looking would keep me safe. The new peephole arrived the next afternoon and I installed it with shaking hands. It fit snug, it looked normal, but the normality didn't restore anything. The boot prints outside had softened by then, filled in by new snowfall blurred into the porch, like they never happened. The only proof left was a small brass ring on my table, and the memory of a fogged circle in my door, the silent confirmation that someone had been close enough to breathe against my home and treat my point of view like something they could unscrew and rearrange. In winter, people worry about footprints because they show you where someone went. I worry about the place footprints end because sometimes the goal isn't your lock. Sometimes the goal is your peephole, the tiny eye you trust, and the sick feeling of realizing it can look both ways. The snowman was standing too close to my living room window, and the footprints that made it never walked away. I noticed it at dawn, because winter light is unforgiving. It turns every shadow into a sharp shape, and that shape in my yard looked like a person pretending not to be one. The snowman was almost life-sized, built with packed, polished snow that looked heavier than the fluffy fall we'd had overnight. Its arms were stick-straight, literal branches, but one arm angled upward in a way that pointed toward my window like a gesture. Its face was simple, 2 dark stones for eyes, a crooked line for a mouth, but the eyes weren't playful. They were positioned a little too high, a little too wide, giving it an expression that didn't read like a child's joke. It read like attention. The yard around it was otherwise pristine, a clean white sheet that should have recorded every step. And it did, in one place, a single set of boot prints coming from the far corner by the fence, crossing the yard in a straight line to the snowman's base. The prints ended there, tight and deep, as if the person had stood at the base and worked. There was no second trail leaving, no path back to the fence, no messy scatter from someone walking away after finishing the job. Just the approach, the work zone, and then nothing. Snow is supposed to make trespassing obvious. That morning it made it impossible to tell where the trespasser went, which meant the only safe assumption was the one I didn't want. They didn't go far. I pulled up the blinds a fraction, just enough to see the snowman's face without placing myself in the open. The stone eyes looked like they were aimed directly into my living room, at the spot where my couch sits at, the place a person relaxes because they believe the yard is empty. My first instinct was to go outside and kick it over. That's what you do with an unwanted snowman, turn it into a pile, and move on. But the prints told me the snowman wasn't the problem. The person who built it was. And if the person didn't leave on the ground, then the snowman might be cover, or a marker, or a message. I called 911 and told the dispatcher there was a fresh snowman directly beneath my living room window, with one set of footprints leading to it, and no tracks leaving. The dispatcher asked if anyone was outside now. I said I didn't know, and that answer felt like a failure. She told me to stay inside and away from windows until officers arrived. Waiting made the snowman feel alive. The longer I stared, the more it looked like it had posture, like the head tilt was intentional, like the stones were placed by someone who understood how faces work. Then I noticed a detail that made my mouth go dry along the snowman's backside. The side facing away from my window, there was a narrow vertical seam where the surface looked smoother, slightly melted and refrozen, like it had been touched, repeatedly, by warm fabric. It looked like a door that had been pressed shut. I forced myself to step away from the window and checked my camera feed because if someone built that thing, they had to have done it while my porch light was off and my curtains were closed. The doorbell camera didn't cover the yard, but my backyard camera did, and at 252A, motion triggered. The feed was grainy with snowfall, but I could see a hooded figure enter the yard, carrying something long branches maybe, and stop exactly where the snowman now stood. For several minutes, the figure moved in a tight radius, bending, lifting, packing, snow with steady motions. It wasn't the playful flailing of kids. It was methodical. At one point, the figure paused, stood still and looked up at my living room window as if checking alignment. Then they went back to work. When the snowman reached full height, the figure crouched behind it, out of the camera's direct view, and stayed there. They didn't leave the yard. They didn't walk away. They simply vanished behind the snowman's bulk, and the camera continued recording empty snowfall and the silhouette of the snowman for another full minute before timing out. The last visible thing was a slight shift in the snowman's outline, a subtle change in its shoulder curve that could have been wind, but there was no wind that night. The storm had been quiet enough to build a person-sized object and then hide behind it. When officers arrived, they approached the snowman, cautiously, which felt ridiculous until you realized the snowman was the only object in the yard large enough to conceal a crouched person. One officer walked the boot prints from the fence to the base and stopped scanning for any continuation. "No exit trail," he said. Another officer circled, wide flashlight angled low, looking for disturbance. The snow around the snowman was packed down in a ring proof of construction. But behind the snowman on the far side, the snow was oddly smooth, like it had been compressed and then lightly dusted over. Not a footprint, not a scuff, a smoothed patch, the size of a kneeling body. The older officer gestured for me to stay inside while they checked it. He took his baton and pressed it gently into the snowman's side. The packed snow resisted thick and dense. He pressed harder. The surface cracked, with a soft, wet sound that made my skin prickle. A chunk slid off, and behind it, the interior wasn't solid. It was hollow. The officer froze for half a second, then stepped back and told his partner to cover. He struck again, breaking a larger section away. The snowman's torso opened like a shell, and something dark moved inside. Fabric, a sleeve, a shoulder, shifting as if whatever had been hiding had been forced to decide between staying still and being discovered. The officers shouted commands. For a moment nothing happened, and then a man unfolded out of the hollow space with a slow, controlled motion like someone standing up after crouching too long. He was wearing a dark hoodie and gloves, both dusted with snow. His face was pale and wet with meltwater, and his hair was plastered to his forehead. He raised his hands, but his eyes didn't look at the officers first. They looked up at my living room window, like he was checking whether I was watching him emerge. That detail felt like the real point of the stunt. The snowman wasn't just a hiding spot. It was a stage. They cuffed him on the lawn, and one officer asked why he was inside a snowman. The man's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "It's quiet," he said, "and people don't look at snowmen." The officers searched the hollow and found the reason the snow had looked too packed. The interior was lined with a silver emergency blanket, the kind that reflects heat, and the base had been reinforced with a plastic sheet to keep it from collapsing. There were also 2 chemical hand warmers used, and a cheap pair of binoculars tucked into the snow like a tool stored in a wall. It wasn't a childish prank. It was a cold weather blind, a way to sit within 10 feet of my window without being recognized as a person. The boot prints had ended at the snowman because he hadn't walked away. He'd climbed inside and let the snow cover his presence. The officers walked the fence line and found where he'd entered one section where snow on the top rail had been brushed away by a gloved hand. He likely hopped over there, then stayed within the packed construction ring, so the only obvious tracks were the approach. When they led him away, the yard felt too empty, like it was waiting to be filled again. The snowman, broken open, slumped into an ugly pile. Its stone eyes lay in the snow like dropped coins, and the crooked mouth was gone. That should have made me feel better. Instead, I kept imagining the minutes on camera where the figure crouched behind the snowman and then vanished from view, and the long stretch where he could have been right there in my yard while I slept, breathing, listening, watching my warm, a living room through the glass, while he sat inside something meant for children. After the officers left, new flakes started falling and began to soften the boot prints at the fence, filling in the construction ring, smoothing the packed kneeling patch until the yard looked normal again. Winter is good at that. It cleans up. It covers. It pretends. But my brain couldn't unlearn what the snow had shown me. A person can come to your home, build something harmless looking in your yard, and use it to erase the line between object and intruder. And once you've seen footprints that end at a snowman, you stop seeing snowmen as decorations. You start seeing them as shapes someone can hide in, placed close enough to your windows that the only thing separating you from a watcher is a wall of packed snow and your willingness to look away. I noticed the tracks because they were too perfect for a dog and too wild for a person. 4-point prints in the fresh snow, clean and sharp, running in a straight line along the edge of my backyard, like something had been trotting with purpose. The storm had ended sometime before dawn, leaving that silent, brittle morning where every sound carries and every mark in the snow feels like a statement. At first, I felt a mild, almost childish curiosity. Wolf, I thought, or coyote, maybe a big stray. We back up to woods, and every winter you hear rumors. Neighbors insisting they saw something larger than a dog slipping between the trees. The prints supported the rumor. Each paw mark had a long oval pad and faint claw points evenly spaced, as if the animal was calm and unbothered by the cold. The trail ran parallel to my fence for about 20 yards, then angled toward the middle of my yard. That's when my stomach tightened, because the prints didn't just pass through. They approached. They came straight toward the small patch beneath my bedroom window, as if the animal had decided my house was the point. Then the paw prints stopped, not in a messy scatter, not in a turnaround, not in a jump. They stopped in a tight cluster like the animal paused and shifted its weight. And directly beside that cluster, in the same untouched snow, a set of human footprints began. One boot print, then another, walking away from the spot where the wolf tracks ended. No overlap, no half step where a boot stepped into a paw print. It was a clean transition, like one creature had become another, without needing to hide the moment. I stood at my window staring at that junction until my eyes hurt. My brain tried to supply the most reasonable explanation first. Someone walked out there earlier, and I'm confusing the patterns. A dog stepped in a boot print. The wind distorted something, but the snow was pristine elsewhere, and the junction was too clear. The paw cluster was distinct. The boot tread was distinct, and the timing was recent enough that the edges of the prints still had that crisp, glassy lip where warm pressure meets cold powder. The human footprints led away toward the woods, but they didn't stride like a normal person. The steps were slightly longer than average, and the spacing had a steady, almost rhythmic quality, measured patient, like whoever made them wasn't in a hurry to get home. I put on boots and went outside, because not knowing felt worse than knowing. I kept my distance from the junction, crouched near the edge, and took photos. Up close, the paw prints looked real deep enough to suggest weight, with a slight drag at the front of one where a claw had scraped. The boot prints looked real too, a common tread pattern you'd see on work boots, but there was something off. The tread was pressed deeper at the toe than the heel, like the person walked leaning forward as if their center of gravity didn't sit where mine does. I followed the trail a few steps, careful not to crush it, and realized another detail I hadn't seen from the window between the paw cluster and the first boot print. There was a shallow smear in the snow, a soft, elongated depression like something had been lowered to the ground. Not a body imprint, not a fall, more like a kneeling or crouching shift, as if whatever paused there had changed posture. The image my brain built was ridiculous and automatic. Something on four legs had crouched, then stood up. I hate that my mind went there, but the snow made it hard not to. I backed away and returned inside with my skin buzzing. I called my neighbor, the one who always talks about coyotes, and asked if he had dogs out last night. He didn't. He hadn't even opened his back door. Then he asked why. I sent him a photo of the junction. He stopped joking immediately. "That's not right," he said. The next call was to 911, because even if the explanation was a prank, a costume, a person messing with tracks, I wanted it documented. I told the dispatcher I had animal tracks in my yard that appeared to turn into human footprints and head into the woods. She paused and asked if anyone was on my property now. I said no, but my voice sounded thin. Officers arrived and walked the trail with that careful, practical attention that makes you feel slightly embarrassed until you see their faces. One officer knelt by the junction and traced the paw cluster with his flashlight beam, even though it was daylight. He said canine with certainty, pointing out pad shape and claw points. Then he moved the beam to the first boot print and said, "Human," in the same flat tone. He looked up at me and asked if I had cameras. I did. We pulled up the backyard feed. The footage was grainy snow, reflecting infrared and turning everything into moving static, but around 314 a.m. The motion sensor triggered. For a few seconds there was nothing but flakes and darkness. Then a shape entered frame, low to the ground, moving fast and smooth, too low to be a deer, too fluid to be a person walking upright. It crossed the yard on four limbs, a dark blur with a long line behind it that could have been a tail or could have been a trick of motion. It stopped beneath my bedroom window and stayed still long enough that the camera tried to refocus. The shape shifted, and for a moment it looked taller, as if it rose. The footage glitched one of those brief digital stutters you usually blame on weather, and when it stabilized, the low shape was gone. In its place, a hooded figure stood exactly where the animal had been. The figure looked up toward my window, as if checking whether I was watching, then turned and walked toward the woods with a steady gait. The officer rewound that segment 3 times, jaw tightening. "Could be 2 subjects," he said carefully. as if he was trying to keep the conversation in the realm of the explainable. Animal comes through, person comes through later. But the timestamps didn't support it. There was no gap. The shape stopped, shifted the feed, glitched, and then the person was there. Another officer stepped closer to the screen and pointed at the snow beneath the figure's feet. "No new prints appearing until here," he said. "He's standing where the paw prints end." They went outside and followed the boot prints to the tree line. At the edge of the woods, the human footprints didn't continue far. They drifted into a patch where branches had shaken loose powder overnight, blurring detail. But the officers found something else there that made the story heavier. A length of dark fur caught on a low branch, snagged like it had brushed past in a hurry. Not a lot, just enough to be real. They bagged it. One officer asked if I owned a dog with a winter coat. I didn't. My neighbor didn't either. They asked if anyone nearby raises huskies or wolves, or has a fur suit. And hearing the word suit out loud made my skin tighten, because it meant the officer's mind had gone to the same ugly place mine had. Before they left, the older officer said something that stuck with me, because it sounded like an attempt to put a fence around a thought. He said, "The snow shows you the story it can show you. It doesn't show you what happened in the air." He explained that someone could have carried something staged tracks or used boards to minimize their own prints. He offered explanations the way people offer blankets, but his eyes kept returning to the junction as if he knew none of the blankets fit perfectly. After the officers left, I kept staring at the paw cluster and the first boot print, the precise point where animal became human in the snow's language. I tried to tell myself it was a prank, someone with a dog, someone in costume. But the camera footage kept replaying in my head, the low shape, the stillness, the glitch, the upright figure. That night the temperature dropped, and a thin layer of new snow dusted the yard, softening the edges of the prints. By morning the junction looked less crisp, less certain, as if winter itself was trying to blur the exact moment that had frightened me. But the fear didn't blur. It sharpened into a new rule. When tracks change, don't just ask what made them. Ask why they changed where they did beneath your window, in the one spot that turns your home into a stage. Ever since, when I see animal prints near my house, I don't smile or point them out. I follow them with my eyes until they either leave my property or do something they shouldn't. Because snow doesn't always show you a predator chasing you. Sometimes it shows you a predator practicing how to look like something else right up until the moment it wants you to notice. The first morning we thought it was a neighbor cutting through the yard. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, thick enough to erase the world, and when I opened the curtains I saw a line of boot prints crossing our front lawn from the street to the side of the house. They stopped at the corner right beneath the guest room window, and then disappeared, because the rest of the yard on that side was hidden by a hedge. I remember shrugging and telling my wife it was probably some kid taking a shortcut. That was day one. Day two was when it stopped being normal. The tracks were there again after another overnight snowfall, but this time they didn't cross the lawn. They circled the house in a tight loop, hugging the foundation like the person wanted to stay close to the walls. They paused at every window, leaving deeper clusters of prints as if they had stood there listening. Under our bedroom window, the cluster was longest. There were 4 deep impressions facing the glass, perfectly spaced like someone had planted their feet and stayed still for a full minute. And just like before, there was no obvious exit trail. No prints back to the street. No path into the yard. Just the loop, the pauses, and an end that didn't make sense. My wife and I checked the doors, checked the windows, checked the garage. Everything was locked. That was supposed to be comforting. Instead, it felt like the locks were irrelevant to the story the snow was telling. Day 3. The tracks came from the woods behind our fence. We don't usually think of the woods as an entrance, because there's a fence, and because the woods belong to nature, not people. But the snow doesn't care about what you assume. A single line of prints started beyond the fence, pressed into the drift under low branches, and then appeared inside our yard, on the other side, as if the person had climbed over. The top rail had a clean brush strip, where snow was missing, like a gloved hand had gripped it. The prints went straight to our back patio, stopped beneath the sliding glass door, and then ended. No prints leaving. No return. My youngest asked if Santa was real that morning, and for a second I wanted to laugh because the boot prints felt like a cruel version of childhood magic. But then my oldest pointed at the last impression on the patio step and said quietly, "Why didn't he go back?" That question changed the air in the kitchen, because kids say the simplest thing that adults keep trying to talk themselves out of. Day 4. The tracks were smaller, not child-sized, barefoot, toe dents, and a heel pressed into the snow in a clean line that ran from the fence to the side of our house, then stopped at the downspout. The snow beneath the downspout was disturbed in a crescent, where someone had braced. Above that, the gutter snowcap was broken into a narrow channel leading toward the roofline. My wife looked up at the roof and went pale. We had never looked at our roof as part of the problem before, but the snow made it obvious. If the prints ended at the downspout, the person didn't vanish. They went up. That was the morning we called the police. The officer who arrived was polite and calm in that practiced way, but his expression changed when he saw the tracks. He walked the yard without stepping on them, looked at the downspout smear, then looked up at the eaves and said, "They've been on your roof." He asked if we had attic access. We did. He opened the hatch and shined his flashlight into the dark. He didn't find anyone, but he found the sign that made my stomach drop, a flattened pocket in the insulation near the vent above our bedroom and a crushed water bottle tucked behind a beam. It wasn't enough to prove someone lived up there long term, but it was enough to prove someone had been there long enough to leave trash. The officer told us to change routines, add lights, add cameras. He told us the obvious call immediately, if we see anyone. Then he left, and the snow kept falling, and we tried to pretend the advice was enough. Day 5, we installed cameras. Day 6, the tracks came anyway. That's what broke something in me. The new snowfall made our yard a clean white sheet, and our cameras should have seen everything. But the tracks were there at dawn. One line of prints to the front porch, a deep cluster at the door, and no trail leaving. We checked the doorbell footage and saw a hooded figure walk up at 302A. Stand at the door without knocking, and then step sideways, out of the camera's view, into the narrow strip behind a porch column. The feed kept running, showing an empty porch while snow fell, and then the figure reappeared briefly, still hooded, still calm, and walked backward down the steps, placing their feet into their own prints until the trail looked like it stopped. At our door. They weren't just trespassing. They were editing the evidence. They wanted the snow to say, "I'm still here." Day 7. The tracks were in the backyard, circling our swing set and ending beneath the window of our oldest room. My wife stood behind me and whispered, "This is on purpose." She wasn't saying the obvious. She was saying the worst thing the person wasn't choosing random windows. They were choosing rooms. They were learning our sleeping map. We started moving the kids into our room at night. Mattresses on the floor, all of us together like a storm shelter without a storm. We kept lights on. We kept the TV on for noise. We told ourselves togetherness was safety. Then came the morning that turned our fear into something sharper than fear. Day 8. After a heavy night of snow, we woke to tracks that didn't approach the house at all. They formed a ring around it. Boot prints deep and evenly spaced, making a circle that hugged the perimeter like a boundary line. At the front, the circle widened into a cluster at the porch steps, as if the person had lingered there. At the back, the circle tightened along the foundation and paused beneath each window. It looked like our house had been tied with a rope made of footsteps. My youngest asked, "Is it to keep us in?" And I hated that question because it felt too accurate. The ring had no start and no end. It was a shape, a message. That morning, my wife called the police again and asked for extra patrols. The dispatcher said they would try. Try is a terrible word when you're staring at a boundary drawn in snow. That night, we didn't sleep. We sat in the living room with lights on and phones charged, and the kids half asleep under blankets. Around 240 a.m., the backyard motion light clicked on. The camera feed showed nothing at first. Snow fell in the beam like glitter. Then a dark shape rose slowly at the bottom edge of the frame, just the top of a hood, as if someone had been crouching below the fence line and stood up carefully. They didn't step fully into view. They stayed at the boundary of the light, a hand lifted and pressed flat against our sliding glass door, for a beat leaving a fog smear, as if warm breath or a warm palm had touched the cold surface. Then the hand slid away, and the figure stepped sideways into shadow again. No sound, no knock, just contact. My wife covered the kid's eyes without thinking. I didn't call out. I didn't move toward the door. I called 911 with shaking hands and whispered that someone was outside, right now. The dispatcher told us to stay inside. We were already inside. That's what made me furious, in a quiet way. Inside didn't feel like safety anymore. Inside felt like the center of a circle someone had drawn. We heard sirens a few minutes later, and the backyard light clicked off. Officers arrived and swept the yard with flashlights, but snowfall had thickened, and by the time they searched the fence line, the footprints were already softening, losing detail, turning into ordinary disturbance. They didn't find anyone. They told us what people always tell you: when winter is your witness, the snow is changing. Evidence is fleeting. Cameras can miss angles. People can hide in blind spots. They said all the true things, and none of them helped. The next morning, day 9, the ring was gone because new snow had filled it in like it never existed. But the message wasn't gone. It had moved. There were footprints on our roof. We saw them from the upstairs hallway window, shallow boot impressions, pressed into the snow cap along the gutter line, leading from the chimney to the vent above our bedroom. A narrow trough showed where someone had crawled low to avoid silhouette. My wife started crying without sound, the kind of crying that happens when your body realizes something your mind has been denying. Because roof tracks mean the person didn't just want to be near us. They wanted to be above us. They wanted the perspective. We called the police again, and this time they brought a ladder and checked the attic thoroughly. They found a crushed energy drink can and a cheap pair of binoculars tucked near the vent. They didn't find a person. The officer told us the truth, in a tone meant to be gentle. He's using weather. He's using time. He's using your routines. That afternoon we packed bags and left. We went to my sister's house across town, somewhere with lights and noise and neighbors close enough to see everything. We told ourselves leaving ended it. We told ourselves the snow at our house could fall as much as it wanted, but it wouldn't be recording us anymore. We stayed away for 3 nights. On the 4th morning, my neighbor called. His voice was tight. He said, "You need to come see something." When we returned, the driveway had been plowed, the sidewalk shoveled the yard clean and bright under a new layer of snow. And on the front porch, directly in front of our door, was a single set of boot prints, leading up the steps and stopping. No prints leaving. Beside the last impression, placed neatly like an object in a display case, was one of my kids' mittens. The red one. The one my youngest lost months ago. I felt the blood drain from my face because I knew we hadn't brought it with us. We hadn't even looked for it. It had been missing long before the tracks began, which meant someone had had it. Someone had kept it. Someone had brought it back to show us they could. The snow hadn't just been recording a stranger. It had been recording a decision. The decision to stay close, to learn our house, to learn our children, to leave messages in the only language winter makes undeniable. We never slept in that house again. We sold it in spring when the grass returned, and the yard looked harmless, like it had never held a ring of footsteps. But I still check snow the way you check locks. I still look for lines that end without leaving, because I learned the worst part of winter isn't the cold. It's how quiet it can be, while someone uses your own yard as a notebook, writing the same sentence over and over until you finally understand it. I was here, I am here, and the snow will cover me as fast as it covers you.